Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The fishing rod felt right in my hands, familiar and solid. A reminder that some things stayed the same even when everything else had changed. Moving to Pinewood Creek Ranch had been Jake's idea. A fresh start for us in Northern California, away from the noise and crowds of Sacramento. I wasn't against it, just unsure. But standing on our land that June morning in 1991, watching sunlight filter through the pines, I felt a flutter of something like hope. "Come on, Sadie," I called to our golden retriever puppy bounding through the tall grass. At 6 months old, she was all awkward paws and endless energy. "Let's go check out that fishing hole Jake found." I adjusted my tackle box in one hand, fishing rod in the other, and started down the worn path that followed the creek into the wooded section of our property. The previous owners had left the place vacant for years. Jake said that's why we got such a good deal. But I sometimes wondered if there were other reasons. The locals in town had been friendly enough, but tight-lipped when we mentioned Pinewood Creek. The morning air felt cool against my skin despite the summer heat building. Pine needles crunched under my boots as Sadie raced ahead, occasionally disappearing into the brush before popping back out with her tongue lolling. I'd grown up fishing with my dad in the streams around Redding, so this felt natural. Therapeutic even. After 3 hectic weeks of unpacking and settling in, I needed this quiet time. 20 minutes into our walk, the trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker. According to Jake, the fishing hole was just another 10 minutes ahead, where the creek widened into a deep pool beneath an outcropping of granite. I whistled for Sadie to stay closer as the path narrowed. That's when I noticed the change. Sadie had stopped dead in her tracks about 15 feet ahead of me, her entire body stiffened, tail tucking between her legs. I'd never seen her like this before, even during thunderstorms that normally terrified her. "Sadie, what's wrong, girl?" I called, quickening my pace. She backed up as I approached, her eyes fixed on something in the trees to our right. When I reached her, she pressed against my legs, trembling. The hair along her spine stood straight up. "It's okay," I said, crouching beside her. "Probably just a deer or—" The sound cut through the forest quietude, a rapid, rhythmic chattering, like teeth clicking together, but with a vocal quality I couldn't place. Not bird, not squirrel, not any animal I recognized from my years outdoors. Sadie growled, a low rumble in her chest that I felt more than heard. Her eyes remained locked on something beyond the closest stand of pines. I followed her gaze, squinting into the dappled shadows. At first, I saw nothing. Then movement caught my eye, not wind in the branches, but deliberate shifting. A large shape partially hidden behind a thick pine trunk about 30 yards away. I stood slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The chattering continued, faster now, almost agitated. That's when it moved slightly, revealing itself, 5 feet tall, maybe a bit more. Muscular build covered in reddish-brown fur or hair that hung in matted clumps. It gripped the tree with one hand, a hand with fingers, actual fingers that looked disturbingly human-like. Its other arm hung down, longer than seemed right, reaching just below what would be knee level. The fur there was longer, shaggier. I couldn't see its face clearly. It kept partially hidden behind the tree. But I could feel it watching me. The chattering never stopped. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear? No. Wrong shape, wrong posture. Mountain lion? Absolutely not. Some person in a costume? Out here, miles from the main road. Sadie's growl deepened, and the creature shifted again. It moved its head, and for a split second I caught a glimpse of dark eyes, set in a face that was neither fully animal nor human. My blood turned to ice water. 29 years of hunting, fishing, and hiking in California's wilderness, and I'd never seen anything like this, not even close. I dropped my tackle box, keeping hold of the fishing rod only because my fingers had locked around it. With my free hand, I grabbed Sadie's collar. "Easy," I whispered, though I'm not sure who I was trying to calm, her or myself. The creature made a sudden movement, leaning slightly away from the tree, and the chattering grew louder. That broke my paralysis. I yanked Sadie back and turned, abandoning my tackle box where it fell. "Run!" I hissed at my dog, who needed no encouragement. We bolted back down the path, Sadie ahead of me now, her fear giving her speed. The fishing rod became an awkward hindrance, whipping against tree branches as I ran, but I couldn't make my fingers release it. My lungs burned after the first 100 yards. The rational part of my brain told me to slow down, to stop and assess the situation calmly. But terror had seized control of my body. After what felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute, I risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing followed, at least nothing I could see. The forest behind us looked empty, innocent in the late morning light. I slowed to a jog, then a walk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Sadie circled back to me, still alert, ears perked for danger. "It's okay," I panted, though I didn't believe it myself. "We're okay." We continued back toward the ranch at a fast walk, my eyes constantly scanning the trees around us. The fishing rod had become a makeshift weapon in my white-knuckled grip. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent fresh adrenaline coursing through my system. When we finally broke through the tree line into the open pasture where our ranch house stood in the distance, I nearly collapsed with relief. Jake's truck wasn't in the driveway. He was still in town picking up fencing supplies. Part of me was glad. I wasn't sure how to explain what I'd seen. Inside the house, I locked the doors and sank into a kitchen chair, my legs shaking too badly to stand. Sadie paced nervously, still agitated. I filled a glass with water from the tap and drank it down, trying to organize my thoughts. What had I seen? Not a bear. I'd encountered black bears before, and this was nothing like that. The way it stood, the proportions of its body, those fingers. A memory surfaced, a tabloid cover I'd seen at the grocery checkout. Bigfoot sightings in Pacific Northwest. I'd laughed at it then. I wasn't laughing now. But Bigfoot was supposed to be much taller, wasn't it? 7, 8 feet at least, according to the stories. This creature was shorter, still bigger than me at 5'4", but not the giant of legends. And that chattering sound, none of the Bigfoot stories I'd heard mentioned anything like that. Maybe it was a juvenile. The thought sent a chill through me. If that was a young one, where was its mother? I reached for the phone on the wall, dialing Jake's friend Bill at the hardware store in town. Bill had lived in the area his whole life. If anyone would know something, it would be him. "Harrison's Hardware," his gruff voice answered on the third ring. "Bill, it's Lily Matthews." "Hey there, Lily. Jake just left here about 20 minutes ago." "Good, that's good. Listen, Bill, I need to ask you something." I hesitated, suddenly aware of how crazy I might sound. "Have there ever been any unusual animal sightings around Pinewood Creek? Specifically on our property?" The silence that followed lasted a beat too long. What kind of unusual are we talking about? His voice had lost its friendly edge. "I saw something in the woods today, near the fishing hole." I swallowed hard. It wasn't a bear or any normal wildlife. It was standing on 2 legs, covered in reddish fur. It had hands, Bill, with fingers. Another long pause. "Where exactly were you when you saw this?" I described the location as best I could. Bill sighed heavily. "Listen, Lily, those woods around Mount Sequoia, they're different, old. There've been stories since before my granddaddy's time." "Stories about what?" I pressed. "The old-timers called them forest people. Most folks nowadays just laugh it off as superstition. But there's been sightings over the years. Not many, mind you. And not the kind of thing people talk about openly unless they want a reputation as the town crackpot." My hand tightened around the receiver. Why didn't anyone tell us this before we bought the place? Would you have believed it? Or would you have thought we were just a bunch of backwards country folk with wild imaginations? His tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. Besides, sightings are rare. The Hendersons owned that property for 30 years before they sold it to you, and old Jim never mentioned seeing anything. Well, I saw something today, I said firmly, and it wasn't my imagination. I believe you, Lily, more than most would. He lowered his voice, though I doubted anyone else was in the store. My cousin Darlene saw something similar up by Spruce Lake back in '83. Never went fishing alone again. What should I do? I asked, hating the quaver in my voice. Nothing to do, really. They generally keep to themselves. Folks who've had encounters say they're not aggressive unless provoked. He paused. Though I wouldn't go back to that fishing hole alone if I were you. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table until Jake's truck pulled into the driveway. Sadie ran to the window, barking, her normal greeting, not the fearful growl from the forest. I didn't tell Jake everything right away, just mentioned seeing something strange in the woods and losing my tackle box. I needed time to process, to decide whether I believed what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the darkness outside seemed amplified. The wind in the pines, an owl's distant call, branches scratching against the side of the house. I kept seeing those fingers wrapped around the tree trunk, hearing that chattering sound that had no place in the natural world I thought I knew. Around dawn, I slipped out of bed and went to the bookshelf in our living room. We had a few local history books the previous owners had left behind. I hadn't paid them much attention during unpacking, but now I pulled them out one by one, scanning their pages for any mention of forest creatures or local legends. In the third book, a self-published collection of stories from early settlers in the region, I found it. A short paragraph describing encounters with small forest men who made talking sounds like wooden blocks clacking together. The account was from 1879, written by a trapper who claimed to have seen them 3 times near what was now our property. I was still sitting there, book in hand, when Jake found me at sunrise. "You okay, Lil? You've been acting strange since yesterday." I looked up at my husband's concerned face and made a decision. I told him everything, the creature, the chattering, my conversation with Bill, and now this old account that matched what I'd experienced. To his credit, Jake didn't dismiss me outright. He sat down heavily on the couch beside me, rubbing his stubbled chin. "You really believe you saw a... what, a Bigfoot?" His tone was careful, neutral. "I don't know what it was," I admitted. "But it wasn't anything normal, Jake. And it wasn't my imagination. Sadie saw it too. You should have seen how terrified she was." He nodded slowly. "Bill's a straight shooter. If he says there have been other sightings, we need to decide what we're going to do," I said. "This is our home now. I need to know if I can walk our property without..." I trailed off, not sure how to finish. Jake reached over and took my hand. "I'll go back with you today. We'll get your tackle box, and I'll see the place where it happened." We went after breakfast, Jake bringing his rifle, just in case. Sadie refused to come with us, whining and retreating to the bedroom when we got out her leash. That, more than anything, convinced Jake I was serious. The forest felt different with Jake beside me, less threatening but somehow more somber, as if it knew we were intruding with new awareness. When we reached the spot where I'd dropped my tackle box, it was gone. "You sure this is where you left it?" Jake asked, scanning the ground. I nodded, a cold sensation creeping up my spine. "Positive." We continued to the area where I'd seen the creature. Nothing seemed disturbed, no unusual tracks, no sign anything had been there. Jake examined the tree, I pointed out, running his hand over the bark. "Something scraped this recently," he said quietly, showing me fresh marks in the bark. "Could be anything, though." We spent another hour searching the area, finding nothing conclusive. As we turned to head back, Jake suddenly froze, raising his hand for silence. The chattering sound came from somewhere to our left, fainter than before but unmistakable. It lasted only seconds before fading away. Jake's face had gone pale. "I heard that," he said, his voice tight. "That wasn't any animal I know." We left quickly, not running but moving with purpose. Back at the ranch, we sat at our kitchen table and had a long discussion about what to do. Moving wasn't an option. We'd invested everything in this place, but I couldn't pretend this hadn't happened either. We came to an agreement. We would stay, but we would be cautious. No solo trips to the wooded areas. Always let each other know where we were going on the property, and we would quietly ask more questions in town, trying to learn what the locals knew without broadcasting our experience. Over the following months, I researched everything I could about Bigfoot sightings, particularly in Northern California. Most descriptions were of much larger creatures, but occasionally I found accounts of smaller individuals, theorized to be juveniles. The chattering sound was mentioned in a few obscure reports, described variously as like wooden teeth clacking, or a fast-paced knocking language. I never saw the creature again, though twice more that summer I heard the chattering sound in distant parts of our woods. Each time I immediately turned back, remembering the fear I'd felt that first day. Sadie eventually returned to her playful self, but remained reluctant to venture into certain parts of our property. We stayed at Pinewood Creek Ranch for 17 years. In that time, we had 3 more possible encounters. Shadows moving upright through distant trees, strange vocalizations at dusk, items left outside mysteriously relocated overnight. We learned to coexist with the uncertainty, to accept that our understanding of the natural world might be incomplete. I never told our story widely. The few times I mentioned it, at a dinner party in town, once to a researcher who contacted landowners in the area, I was met with skepticism or patronizing smiles. After a while, it became our private knowledge, a secret shared between Jake and me, and occasionally with locals who had their own stories they rarely told. We sold the ranch in 2008, when Jake's health made maintaining it too difficult. I sometimes wonder if the new owners have had their own encounters, if they've heard the chattering from the woods beyond the creek. I wonder if they'd recognize it for what it is, or dismiss it as just another strange forest sound. What I saw that day in 1991 doesn't fit neatly into science books or natural history museums. But it was real as the fishing rod I still own, as real as the nightmares I occasionally still have. Whatever lives in those woods around Mount Sequoia has been there longer than our ranch, longer than the trappers' cabins, longer perhaps than human memory in that region. I haven't been back to Pinewood Creek since we moved, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of evening, I find myself listening, half expecting to hear that distinctive chattering coming from just beyond the edge of what I can see. Story 2. I woke up suddenly. Something pulled me from sleep, though I couldn't tell what. The cabin was quiet except for the soft snoring of my classmates. It was dark, with just enough moonlight filtering through the window beside my bunk to make out vague shapes. I rolled over, facing the window, hoping to see the stars I'd been watching when I fell asleep. Instead, I found myself staring directly into a pair of glowing red eyes. My body froze. The eyes were level with mine, which meant whatever they belonged to was tall, since I was in a top bunk. They didn't blink. They just stared, unmoving, fixated on me. The window frame surrounded the eyes like a picture. I could make out a dark shape, a head or face, but no details except those burning red orbs, like hot coals in the darkness. 1 second passed. 2, 5, 10. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My breath caught in my throat. Then it grunted, a deep guttural sound that vibrated through the glass. I screamed, not a short yelp, but a full-throated, lung-emptying howl that tore from my mouth before I even knew what was happening. The cabin erupted into chaos. Boys jolted awake, voices calling out in confusion. The overhead light flicked on. Mr. Peterson, our cabin supervisor, rushed in from his small private room at the end of the cabin. Thomas! Thomas, what's wrong?" Mr. Peterson grabbed my shoulders, steadying me as I tried to scramble backward, away from the window. I pointed, my hand shaking so badly I could barely control it. There was a face, red eyes, outside the window. Mr. Peterson looked where I pointed, but I already knew the eyes were gone. The window showed only darkness. "It's okay, Thomas. Just a nightmare." Mr. Peterson's voice was calm, trying to settle me down. "You were dreaming." "No," my voice cracked. "It was real. There was something looking at me. It had red eyes. It made a noise." The other boys were sitting up in their bunks now. Jimmy Lester from the bottom bunk below me peeked out cautiously. "I heard something," Jimmy said, "like a grunt or something." "That was just Thomas having his nightmare," Mr. Peterson said firmly. "But I knew what I saw, what I heard. It wasn't a dream. Those eyes had been real." The cabin door opened, and Mr. Walton, the other supervisor, stepped in. With him came a smell so foul I immediately gagged. It was worse than any skunk I'd ever smelled, like rotting meat left in the sun for days. "Everything okay in here?" Mr. Walton asked, looking around at all of us wide-eyed boys. Mr. Peterson walked over to him, and they stepped outside the cabin door. Their voices were low, but in the quiet of the night, with everyone listening, I could make out parts of their conversation. Outside the main building, tracks in the mud. "Might be best if we—" They came back in a minute later. Mr. Peterson clapped his hands together once, forcing a cheerful tone. "All right, boys, change your plans. Let's all get dressed and head over to the main hall. We'll get an early start on breakfast duty." "It's only 4:30, Bobby Thatcher protested, pointing at his watch. "Early bird gets the worm, Mr. Walton said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's move, everyone, quickly now." As we dressed, I noticed Mr. Peterson looking out the windows, then methodically locking each one. He never did that before. Mr. Walton stood by the door, glancing outside every few seconds. We filed out of the cabin into the cool night air. The sky was still dark, stars visible above the treetops. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Walton kept us in a tight group, hurrying us along the path toward the main building of Cedar Lake Camp. I looked back at our cabin, half expecting to see those red eyes watching us leave. There was nothing there. But as we walked, I could have sworn I heard branches breaking in the woods to our right. The trip to the main hall took only 2 minutes, but it felt longer. The whole time, that terrible smell lingered in my nostrils. Inside the main hall, the lights were already on. Mrs. Dawson, the camp cook, looked surprised to see us. "You're early," she said, frowning at Mr. Peterson. "Thought we'd get a head start," he replied, his voice too casual. "The boys are all up anyway." Mrs. Dawson raised an eyebrow, but didn't question it further. We got to work setting up for breakfast, laying out plates and cups, filling juice pitchers. The smell was gone inside the hall, but I couldn't forget it. Couldn't forget those eyes either, staring directly at me through the glass. Jimmy sidled up next to me as we folded napkins. "What did you really see, Thomas?" he whispered. "I told you. Red eyes, a face at the window." "You think it was a bear?" I shook my head. "Bears don't have red eyes, and it was too tall." "Bigfoot?" Jimmy's eyes widened. "I don't know what it was," I said truthfully. By the time the sun rose and the rest of the camp came to breakfast, the story had spread. Not the truth, but a version where I had a nightmare and screamed like a baby. The girls from Cabin 3 giggled when I walked by with a stack of plates. Donnie Miller made glowing eyes with his fingers every time he looked at me. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Walton never confirmed what happened. When I tried asking Mr. Peterson later that day if he believed me, he just patted my shoulder and said, "The forest can play tricks on your eyes at night, Thomas. Don't worry about it." But I saw the adults whispering. I noticed how the remaining outdoor activities that day were moved closer to the main buildings, how the night hike planned for our last evening was cancelled due to weather concerns, despite the sky being clear. The teasing continued throughout the 3-day trip. "Watch out for Thomas's monster," became a running joke. By the time we boarded the bus back to school, I had stopped trying to convince anyone. On the ride home, I sat alone, watching the Canadian wilderness pass by through the window. Trees and more trees, stretching out for miles. I couldn't help wondering what else was out there, hiding among them, waiting. When my mom picked me up from school, she asked the usual questions about the trip. "Did you have fun? What did you learn?" I told her about the lake, the hiking, the wildlife presentation. I didn't mention the red eyes or the smell. I couldn't explain it, and I knew she wouldn't believe me either. That night at home in my own bed, I kept my curtains tightly closed. For many nights after, I did the same. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually the memory became less sharp, buried under school lessons and baseball games and normal life. But I never forgot. Not really. Sometimes when I was alone in my room, I'd think about those glowing red eyes and the creature they belonged to. I'd remember the smell that came afterward, and the way the adults had rushed us to safety without ever admitting why. Every time I went camping with my family in the summers that followed, I'd lie awake in our tent, listening for grunts in the night. Every time we drove past forests on family trips, I'd scan the tree line, half expecting to see a tall figure watching from the shadows. I never told anyone the full story. Not my friends as we grew up. Not my wife when we got married years later. It seemed too strange, too unbelievable, and part of me feared that talking about it would somehow summon it back. 43 years passed. I built a life, had a career, raised kids who now had kids of their own. I was 53 when my mother, now in her 70s, came to visit me in October. We sat on my back porch, watching the sun set beyond the trees at the edge of my property. "You know," she said suddenly, "you changed after that school trip to Canada when you were 10. I looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You used to love looking out your window at night. After that trip, you kept your curtains closed for years. You never wanted to go camping again either." I stared at her, feeling the weight of the secret I'd carried. "You remember that?" "Of course I do. I was worried about you. You never would say what happened." Maybe it was the way the trees cast long shadows across my yard as darkness fell. Maybe it was the feeling that I'd carried this alone for too long. Whatever the reason, I found myself telling her everything. The eyes, the grunt, the smell, the way the teachers had hurried us away. When I finished, I expected her to laugh or at least look skeptical. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Your grandfather used to tell stories," she said, "about things in the forests up north, things with red eyes." A chill ran down my spine. "What things?" She shook her head. "He never said exactly. Just that there were creatures in the deep woods that people shouldn't disturb. I always thought they were just stories to keep us kids from wandering too far." We sat in silence for a while after that. "Do you believe me?" I finally asked. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "I believe you saw something, Tommy. Something real enough to scare you for 40 years. That conversation with my mother unlocked something in me. The fear I'd carried since that night at Cedar Lake Camp didn't disappear, but it changed somehow. Sharing it made it less of a burden. I started researching, looking into local legends around Nordegg, Alberta, trying to find any reports similar to what I experienced. I found a few scattered accounts. Hikers who reported red eyes watching them from the trees, hunters who encountered strange smells and heard unexplained noises. Nothing conclusive, but enough to tell me I wasn't alone. I still don't know what stared at me through that cabin window in 1977. I can't explain the eyes or the smell or why our teachers rushed us away before dawn. But I know what I saw was real. Sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night with the sensation of being watched. I'll look at my bedroom window, half expecting to see those red eyes staring back at me again. They never are, but the feeling remains that somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond civilization, something waits. Something remembers me just as clearly as I remember it. I keep my curtains open these days, not because I'm not afraid anymore, but because after all these years, I want to know if it ever comes back. I want to be ready. And sometimes, when the night is especially quiet and dark, I think I catch a whiff of that same putrid smell on the breeze. Just for a moment. Just enough to remind me that what I saw at Cedar Lake Camp was more than a nightmare. It was a glimpse of something most people go their whole lives without seeing, something that lives in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I'm 56 now, and I've never returned to Cedar Lake. I've never gone back to Nordegg, Alberta, but I know if I did, I'd scan every window, every tree line, looking for those red eyes. Because whatever I saw that night is still out there, and sometimes I think it's still looking for me too. Story 3. I lowered my backpack onto the worn picnic table, checking my watch. 6:37 a.m. The early Sunday morning air at Fort Sill felt crisp against my skin, carrying that Oklahoma spring dampness. The parking lot sat empty except for my truck, exactly how I wanted it. Sudan paced at my feet, her blue coat catching the morning light, muscles tense beneath her skin, ready for our hike. "Ready for some exercise, girl?" I asked, reaching down to scratch behind her ears. Sudan's tail wagged once, her eyes locked on mine. I'd had her since she was 8 weeks old, put her through the same training regimens I'd learned in the service. She wasn't just a pet. She was the closest thing to family I had in Oklahoma. I clipped her tactical harness on, secured my 9mm Glock in its holster, and grabbed my backpack. Standard procedure, even for a simple hike. 15 years in the military doesn't leave you easily. Some habits stick. We headed toward Timber Ridge Trail, the least used path on base. Perfect for a Sunday morning when I wanted to avoid the weekend warriors and their families. The trail wound through dense forest before opening to a ridge overlooking the valley. We'd done this hike dozens of times since I'd been stationed at Fort Sill. The first 10 minutes went like clockwork. Sudan trotted ahead, stopping occasionally to wait for me, her training keeping her within 15 feet at all times. The woods were silent except for occasional birdsong and the crunch of our footsteps on the path. Then everything changed. Sudan froze. Her body went rigid, hackles rising along her spine. Before I could command her, she let out 3 sharp barks, not her playful bark or her alert bark. This was her threat bark, reserved for serious situations. "Sudan, quiet," I commanded firmly. She fell silent immediately but remained tense, her eyes fixed on something in the dense trees to our right. I followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual, just trees, underbrush, shadows. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of sticks breaking. Not the light snap of a squirrel or rabbit, but heavy breaks. Something big was moving through the woods. I reached for my Glock, keeping it holstered, but ready. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cutting through the morning air. No response. Just more breaking branches, closer now. Sudan growled low in her throat, a sound I rarely heard from her. "Identify yourself," I called again, military training kicking in automatically. The response came in the form of a large stick flying through the air, landing with a heavy thud just 10 feet from where we stood. Not thrown randomly, aimed at us. I drew my Glock, holding it at the ready position. "This is your final warning. I am armed." The breaking sounds intensified, like a bulldozer pushing through the underbrush. Whatever was out there wasn't backing down. Sudan's growl deepened, her body coiled like a spring. My mind flashed back suddenly to when I was 8 years old, riding in the back of my parents' station wagon through the Ozarks. The image that had burned into my brain that day, a tall, dark figure standing at the tree line, watching our car pass. My parents, both raised in West Virginia, had exchanged a knowing look. Later that night, I'd overheard them talking about wild men and forest people. I'd dismissed it as mountain superstition. Those memories flashed through my mind in a split second as I made a decision. "Sudan, attack!" I commanded sharply. Without hesitation, she launched forward into the woods, a blur of muscle and determination. I moved after her, Glock raised, trying to keep visual contact. 20 feet into the dense brush, all hell broke loose. Sudan's attack bark turned into a sound I'd never heard her make, part growl, part yelp. Heavy footfalls shook the ground. Underbrush crashed and splintered. I could hear Sudan engaged in a struggle, her trained attack techniques meeting something that wasn't yielding. "Sudan!" I shouted, pushing forward. The sounds intensified, grunting, stomping, growling. I fired 3 warning shots into the air, the gunshots cracking through the morning silence. For 2 seconds, everything went quiet. I pushed through the final layer of brush to a small clearing and saw it, just a glimpse as it turned away. Massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair. Not a bear, not a man, something else entirely. It was moving away at incredible speed, and under its arm, Sudan, my dog, my partner. "No!" I shouted, raising my Glock and emptying the clip in rapid succession. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 shots, fired in controlled pairs, just like I'd been trained. I'm certain at least 4 rounds hit the target. I heard the impact, but it didn't stop, didn't fall, just crashed through the forest with my dog, the sounds fading within seconds. I stood there, empty gun in my hand, heart pounding, sweat running down my face despite the cool morning. For a moment I couldn't process what had happened. Then training kicked in. I reloaded, began tracking. Blood spots. Not much, but there was a trail. Dark, almost black blood, unlike anything I'd seen before. I followed it for nearly a mile, calling Sudan's name periodically, hoping to hear her responsive bark. Nothing. The blood trail ended at a creek. I crossed, searched the opposite bank for signs. Nothing. I expanded my search, moving in widening circles for hours. Nothing. No Sudan, no creature, no further tracks or blood. By late afternoon, exhaustion forced me back to my truck. I sat behind the wheel, staring through the windshield, trying to make sense of what had happened. Sudan was gone. Taken. By something I couldn't explain. I didn't file a report. Who would believe me? Some desk jockey writing down that Staff Sergeant Marcus Jackson lost his dog to Bigfoot. I'd be laughed off base or worse, sent for psychological evaluation. And the civilian authorities? The so-called cryptid hunters and Bigfoot researchers? I'd seen their websites and TV shows. They weren't after truth. They were after ratings and clicks. Instead, I went home to my empty apartment, cleaned my gun, and drank until I couldn't see the image of Sudan being carried away by that thing. The next morning, I walked into my commanding officer's office and requested deployment to Iraq. He was surprised. Most guys were trying to avoid rotation, but approved it. 15 days later, I was on a transport plane heading to Baghdad. 15 months in a war zone felt easier than staying at Fort Sill with the memories of what happened on that trail. At least in Iraq, I understood the enemy. I knew what I was fighting. My first week back from deployment, I bought an AR-15 with thermal scope. Some guys blow their combat pay on cars or women. I spent mine on firepower. I moved off base to a small cabin 40 miles from Fort Sill, closer to the Ouachita Mountains. I told everyone it was because I wanted peace and quiet after Iraq. The truth was, I needed to be where I could prepare. Every weekend, I hiked different trails in the region, not for enjoyment, for reconnaissance, for another chance. I carried the AR-15, extra ammo, and wore a tactical vest. Local hikers gave me wide berth when they saw me coming. Fine by me. 6 months of searching turned up nothing but rumors from locals, stories about missing pets, strange noises in the night, shadows moving through yards. I collected these accounts methodically, marking locations on topographic maps, looking for patterns. Then came the night that confirmed everything. I was on my porch, drinking coffee, scanning the tree line with night vision goggles, routine I'd established since returning. At 22:17, movement caught my attention. Just inside the tree line, approximately 175 yards from my position, something large, moving with surprising stealth for its size. I set down my coffee, picked up the AR-15, and switched on the thermal scope. The figure blazed bright in the display, bipedal, approximately 7 feet tall, moving with purpose along the edge of my property. My finger moved to the trigger. One squeeze and I'd have confirmation. I'd have revenge for Sudan. But then it turned, as if sensing it was being watched. Even through the thermal scope, I could feel its eyes meeting mine across the distance. We stared at each other for 17 seconds. I counted each one in my head. It raised one massive arm, pointing directly at me. A warning, a challenge, a promise. Then it was gone, melting into the forest, with shocking speed for something so large. I lowered the rifle, my heart pounding in my chest. Not from fear, from certainty. I wasn't crazy. What happened at Fort Sill was real. Sudan hadn't died because of my imagination or PTSD or any other convenient explanation. The next day, I began reinforcing my cabin. Steel security doors, motion sensors, floodlights covering every approach. I dug a perimeter trench and installed steel stakes at 45-degree angles facing outward, not enough to stop a determined attack, but enough to slow it down, channel it where I wanted. Some nights, I'd wake to the sound of breaking branches in the distance. I'd grab the rifle, check the monitors I'd set up around the property. Nothing on camera, but the sounds were real. It was letting me know it was there. Watching, waiting. The locals started noticing my preparations. Rumors spread. The crazy vet getting ready for the apocalypse. I didn't care, let them talk. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. They hadn't lost what I'd lost. One evening, Sheriff Dawkins drove up my access road. Good man, Vietnam vet. Understood about coming back from war, different than you left. We'd talked a few times at the general store in town. Marcus, he said, leaning against his cruiser. Folks in town are concerned. Say you're fortifying like you're expecting an invasion. I invited him in for coffee. Showed him my maps, my research. Told him about Sudan, about what happened at Fort Sill. Not the official version I'd put in my report about my dog running off during a hike. The truth. He didn't laugh, didn't call me crazy, just listened, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then, my daddy used to talk about things in these woods, called them different names depending on who was listening, said they'd been here long before us, would be here long after. You believe in them? I asked. Belief's got nothing to do with it. They're here whether we believe or not. He stood up, put his hat back on. Just be careful, Marcus. Some things aren't meant to be hunted. It took Sudan, I said. My dog, my family. He nodded slowly. And you think killing it brings her back? I had no answer for that. After he left, I sat on my porch until dawn, rifle across my lap, watching the tree line. Sometime around 3 a.m, I heard a sound that froze my blood. A bark. Distant, faint, but distinctive. Sudan's bark. Not her warning bark or her play bark. Her come-find-me bark. I was on my feet instantly, rifle ready, scanning the darkness. Nothing visible. The bark came again, further away this time, deeper into the forest. It was bait. A lure. I knew it with absolute certainty. I went inside, closed and locked the door, checked all the monitors. Nothing visible, but I knew it was out there. Using Sudan's bark, or something that sounded exactly like Sudan's bark, to draw me out. That was 3 days ago. I haven't left the cabin since. I've been watching, waiting, documenting everything. The sounds come every night now, breaking branches, Sudan's bark, sometimes what sounds like footsteps on my porch, though the cameras show nothing. Last night, something scratched at my bedroom window. 3 long, slow scratches that left marks in the glass. I fired through the window, hit nothing. I'm not scared. I'm ready. Whatever that thing is, Bigfoot, wild man, forest person, whatever name you want to give it, it made a mistake taking Sudan. It revealed itself to someone trained to fight, someone with the will and the means to hunt it down. The sun is setting now. I've checked my weapons, reviewed the camera feeds, secured all entry points. Tonight might be the night it makes its move, or tomorrow, or next week, doesn't matter. I'll be ready. What happened at Fort Sill wasn't just a sighting, it wasn't just an encounter, it was a declaration of war, and I intend to finish it. And Story 4. I knew the path by heart. Even in the dark, I could feel the familiar dips and rises of the hillside behind my house. The moon hung bright and full overhead, casting long shadows across the scrubby terrain of the reservation. My sneakers made soft crunching sounds against the dry earth as I climbed, pausing every few yards to whistle our signal. My name is Nina Whitehorse. It was June 14th, 1988, and I was 16 years old, sneaking out of my bedroom window at 10 p.m. to meet my boyfriend Daryl. We'd been doing this for weeks now. My parents would have killed me if they knew. I whistled again, our familiar 3-note tune. The sound cut through the night air, but no answering whistle came back. Weird. Daryl was usually waiting for me halfway up the hill. I checked my digital watch, 10:12 p.m. I wasn't late. I kept walking, following the path that wound between juniper trees and around large rocks. The reservation stretched out below me, scattered lights from homes like fallen stars against the darkness. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, the sound carrying in the still night air. That's when I saw him, maybe 50 yards ahead, a tall figure moving between the trees. "Daryl!" I called, not too loud. Sound carried at night, and the last thing I needed was for someone to hear me and tell my parents. The figure didn't turn. It just kept walking uphill, away from me. "Daryl, wait up!" I picked up my pace, annoyed. He knew I hated when he played games like this. The figure moved steadily uphill, its stride longer than mine. From behind, all I could see was a dark silhouette against the moonlit landscape. Taller than I remembered Daryl being, but distance plays tricks on you at night. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I climbed faster. The June heat lingered even after sunset, and the hillside was steep here. Juniper branches scratched my bare arms as I pushed through them. "Come on, this isn't funny," I called out, louder this time. The figure didn't slow down or turn around. I followed for another 5 minutes, farther up the hill than Daryl and I usually went. This wasn't the way to our usual meeting spot at Rocky Ridge Point. We were heading deeper into the hills, toward territory I didn't know as well. My initial annoyance turned to concern. "Daryl, seriously, stop!" I shouted, no longer caring if anyone heard me. The figure continued moving away, maintaining the same distance between us no matter how fast I walked. I was about to give up, turn around and head home, when I heard it. A whistle, our whistle, 3 clear notes coming from my left, back toward Rocky Ridge Point. I froze. The whistle came again from the direction I should have gone in the first place. I looked back to where the dark figure had been walking. Nothing. The hillside ahead was empty, moonlight illuminating open spaces between trees. No movement, no figure, nothing. The hairs on my arms stood up despite the warm night. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Daryl?" I called out, my voice smaller now. "Nina!" His voice called back from the direction of the whistle. "Over here!" I didn't waste time. I turned and ran toward his voice, heart hammering in my chest. My feet slid on loose gravel as I half ran, half slid down a slope, and then across toward Rocky Ridge Point. The familiar outcropping of rocks appeared ahead, and there was Daryl, sitting on our usual flat stone. He stood as I approached. "Hey, what took you so long? I've been waiting." I crashed into him, wrapping my arms around his waist and pressing my face against his chest. His t-shirt smelled like laundry detergent and that cheap cologne he always wore. I'd never been so happy to smell that stupid cologne. "Whoa," he said, arms going around me. "What's wrong? You're shaking." I pulled back enough to look at his face in the moonlight. "I thought I was following you. There was someone walking up ahead of me, and I thought it was you being a jerk, not answering when I called." Daryl's expression changed, his eyebrows drawing together. "What? I've been here the whole time, whistling every couple minutes." "But I saw someone," I insisted, "a tall figure walking uphill. I followed them for a good 10 minutes before I heard your whistle." Daryl stepped back, his hands gripping my shoulders. He scanned my face, then glanced up at the hillside I'd come from. "Are you crazy? You must have followed the hairy one." The way he said it, matter of fact, like I should know exactly what he meant, sent a fresh wave of chills through me. "The what?" I asked, though something in me already knew. Stories whispered at sleepovers, warnings from grandparents, things you weren't supposed to talk about directly. Daryl pulled me back to our sitting rock, keeping his arm around my shoulders. "The hairy one. You know what I'm talking about, Nina. Everyone knows about it." I did know. Not in the way you know facts from school, but in the way reservation kids know things without being explicitly taught. Warnings passed down, places you don't go alone, creatures you don't name outright or talk about unless you have to. "It led me away," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. It was taking me deeper into the hills. Daryl nodded, his face serious in a way I rarely saw it. "My uncle saw it once when he was hunting. Said it looked like a man from a distance, but when he got closer, he stopped, glancing nervously at the darkness beyond our little moonlit spot." "What?" I demanded. "What did he say?" "Said it wasn't a man at all. Too tall, too wrong, covered in dark hair but walking on 2 legs. He fired a warning shot and it disappeared into the trees." I shuddered, remembering the tall figure I'd been following. It had maintained such a precise distance, close enough to keep me following, far enough that I couldn't see details. "I thought it was you," I whispered. "It wanted you to think that," Daryl said. "That's what it does. It tricks people, gets them to follow it deeper into the hills." "And then what?" Daryl shrugged, but his casual gesture couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. "Nobody knows for sure, because the ones who follow it all the way don't come back to tell." We sat in silence for a minute, the weight of what had almost happened settling over us. The familiar landscape around me suddenly seemed different, the shadows deeper, the night sounds more ominous. "We should go," Daryl finally said. "I'll walk you home." I nodded, standing on shaky legs. As we picked our way down the hill toward my house, I couldn't stop myself from looking back over my shoulder every few steps. I didn't tell my parents what happened that night. What would I say? That I'd snuck out to meet my boyfriend and almost got lured away by some creature? That would mean triple punishment for sneaking out, for having a boyfriend they didn't approve of, and for talking about things we weren't supposed to acknowledge. But I did talk to my grandmother the next day. Not directly about what I'd seen, but around it, in the careful way these conversations happened. Grandma Martha lived in a small house on the other side of the reservation. I rode my bike over after lunch, claiming I wanted to help her with her garden. My grandmother was 92 that summer, her face a map of deep wrinkles, her hands gnarled but still strong enough to work the earth. We knelt side by side in her vegetable garden, pulling weeds in the hot afternoon sun. Sweat trickled down my back as I worked up the courage to bring up what had happened. "Grandma," I finally said, keeping my eyes on the ground, "do you know the stories about the one in the hills? The one people don't talk about?" Her hands paused in their work. I could feel her looking at me, but I didn't meet her eyes. "What makes you ask about such things?" Her voice was careful, neutral. I shrugged. pulling a stubborn weed with more force than necessary. Just curious. Curiosity can lead to attention, she said. And attention from some things is not what you want. I finally looked up at her. The sun cast half her face in shadow under the brim of her straw hat. But it's just stories, right? To keep kids from wandering too far. Grandma Martha studied me for a long moment. You saw something. It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. She sighed, sitting back on her heels. The old ones talked about them more openly. Said they've been here longer than us. They look like men sometimes, animals others. They can trick you into following them. She paused, then added, they're clever, and they're hungry. Hungry for what? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Grandma Martha went back to her weeding. For life, for the warmth of it. We worked in silence for several minutes before she spoke again. Your grandfather encountered one when he was young like you, before we were married. This was news to me. What happened? He was hunting deer up in the northern hills, followed what he thought was a track for hours. By the time he realized he was being led in circles, the sun was setting. She pulled a weed with a sharp tug. He made a fire and stayed put until morning. Said he could hear it circling his camp all night just beyond the firelight. Was he scared? I asked. Grandma Martha's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. He was terrified, but he knew what to do. Stay put, don't follow, don't engage. When morning came, he walked straight back, never looking over his shoulder, even when he heard footsteps behind him. I thought about how I'd followed the figure without question, how easily I'd been tricked. I saw one last night, I admitted. I thought it was someone else. I followed it uphill for a while. My grandmother's hands went still again. You're lucky then. Lucky your friend was there to call you back. She fixed me with a stern look. Don't go into those hills at night again, Nina. Not for any reason. I won't, I promised, and I meant it. But promises made in daylight sometimes feel different when darkness falls. 2 weeks passed. I kept my promise, staying home after dark. Daryl came over to watch TV with my parents in the living room, all proper and supervised. We exchanged looks when my dad wasn't watching, communicated in notes passed at school, but the nighttime meetings stopped. Then came the night of Becky Johnson's birthday party. Her parents were out of town, and everyone from school was going. My parents reluctantly agreed I could go, but I had to be home by 11. The party was on the other side of the reservation, past the hills. The logical route was around the hills, taking the main road. It was longer but safer. The shortcut went through the hills, cutting the travel time in half. I left Becky's house at 10:30, plenty of time to get home if I took the shortcut. I hesitated at the fork in the road, looking at the path that led between the hills. In the dark, the gap between them looked like a mouth waiting to swallow me. I should take the long way, I thought. But that would mean being late. And my dad had been clear about my curfew. Just this once, I decided. I'll go through quickly, stay on the path. No detours. The night was different from 2 weeks ago. No bright moon, just a thin crescent offering minimal light. Clouds scudded across the sky, alternately revealing and hiding the stars. My flashlight beam bounced ahead of me as I walked briskly along the path, trying not to let my imagination run wild. I was halfway through the hills when I heard the whistle. I stopped. The sound had come from off to my right, away from the path. 3 notes, our signal. "Daryl?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the darkness. No answer, just another whistle, farther away this time. My heart started racing. This felt familiar, too familiar. But how would it know Daryl's whistle? Unless it had been watching us, learning our signals, our patterns. I turned and started walking faster along the path, keeping my eyes straight ahead. The whistle came again, this time from my left. I did not turn to look. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely keep walking. Another sound joined the whistling. Footsteps. heavy ones moving parallel to my path but just out of sight in the trees. They matched my pace at first, then started moving faster. Whatever it was trying to get ahead of me. I broke into a run, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The footsteps broke into a run too, crashing through underbrush. It was going to cut me off. I reached the spot where the path curved around a large rock formation. If I kept on the path, I'd have to slow down to navigate the narrow passage. If it was waiting for me there, I made a split-second decision. Veering off the path, I scrambled up the rocky slope to my right. It was steep, but I knew these hills. There was a ledge up top that led straight to the road, bypassing the narrow passage entirely. My hands scraped against rock as I climbed, flashlight clenched between my teeth. Below and behind me, I heard something large moving fast through the brush, heading for the path I'd abandoned. I reached the ledge and pulled myself up, then started running along it. The ledge was only about 2 feet wide, with a steep drop to my right. One misstep, and I'd tumbled down the rocky slope. A sound from below made me glance down. In the spill of my flashlight beam, I caught a glimpse of something moving up the slope after me, something large and dark, climbing with inhuman speed. I ran faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The ledge widened as it curved around the hillside. Ahead, I could see the road so close. A car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the area. Behind me, something made a sound. Not quite human, not quite animal. A low, rumbling noise that seemed to vibrate through the rocks beneath my feet. The road was 20 yards away now, 10, 5. I burst out onto the asphalt just as another car approached. I waved my arms frantically and the car slowed, then stopped. An older woman rolled down her window looking concerned. "Are you all right, honey? What are you doing out here alone?" I glanced back toward the hills. Nothing visible now, but I could feel it watching from the darkness. "I got lost," I gasped. "Can you give me a ride? I live on Coyote Creek Road." She unlocked the passenger door. "Get in. That's not far from my place." I scrambled into the car, locking the door immediately. As we pulled away, I kept my eyes on the side mirror, watching the dark outline of the hills recede. "You shouldn't be walking these roads at night," the woman said, clicking her tongue. "Especially not through those hills. Don't you know better?" I didn't answer. In the side mirror, I thought I saw a tall, dark figure step onto the road where I'd been standing moments before. The car turned a corner, and the hills disappeared from view. That was 35 years ago. I left the reservation for college and never moved back, though I visit my family regularly. During those visits, I never go near the hills after dark. Never. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind makes strange sounds around my house in Albuquerque, I think about what might have happened if I'd kept following that figure deeper into the hills, or if I hadn't made it to the road in time during my second encounter. Last month, I took my 16-year-old daughter to visit her great-grandmother, who's somehow still alive at 127. While my daughter was in the bathroom, Grandma Martha took my hand in her gnarled one. "She looks just like you did," she said, nodding toward the bathroom door. "Headstrong too, I bet." I nodded, smiling. Too smart for her own good sometimes. Grandma Martha's grip tightened. "You've told her what to watch for, what to avoid." I hesitated. My daughter had grown up in the city, far from the reservation and its secrets. I'd protected her from those stories, those fears. "She doesn't need to know," I said. "We don't live there anymore." Grandma Martha's dark eyes held mine. "They're spreading, Nina, moving beyond the hills. People see them in the city parks now at night, following hikers in the mountains outside town." A chill ran through me, the same cold feeling I'd experienced 35 years ago. "The hairy ones," she whispered. "They're hungry still, and they remember you." My daughter returned, oblivious to our conversation. But that night I sat her down and started telling her what to watch for, what to avoid, How to recognize when something is mimicking human behavior but isn't human at all. Because some hungers never fade, and some predators are very, very patient. Story 5. My name is Maria Sanchez, and what I'm about to tell you happened in 1990. I've kept it locked away for decades, but some memories don't fade, no matter how much time passes. It was early October when I drove out to my uncle's property south of Gallup. The place sat at the edge of what locals called Shadow Mesa, a jagged outcropping that cast long, dark silhouettes across the red earth as the sun set. My uncle's hogan stood about 50 yards from the main road, a traditional 8-sided dwelling made of logs and packed earth. Behind it sat 3 broken-down Chevys and a garage where my boyfriend Tommy and his friends liked to work on engines. My daughter Lucia was only 6 months old then. She had Tommy's dark eyes and my mother's round face. I'd wrapped her in a yellow blanket my grandmother had made, its edges frayed from constant washing. The drive from Albuquerque had tired her out, and she slept against my chest in a sling as I carried our bags inside. "We'll be out by the fire," Tommy said, kissing my forehead. His hands were already stained with motor oil, a permanent feature since he'd started working at the garage in town. "Just holler if you need anything." I nodded, watching him join his 3 friends, Dale, Ronnie, and Mike, as they hauled firewood to a pit about 20 yards from the hogan. The sun was already dipping below the mesa, painting everything in red-gold light. Uncle Joe was away visiting family in Flagstaff, so we had the place to ourselves for the weekend. Inside, the hogan smelled of juniper and sage. A wood stove sat in the center, cold now but ready for winter. I laid Lucia in the portable crib I'd set up in the corner, furthest from the door. She stirred, small fists clenching, then settled back into sleep. I unpacked our things, listening to the men's voices grow louder as night fell. Their laughter carried on the dry desert air, punctuated by the crack and pop of the bonfire. Through the single window, I could see their silhouettes moving around the flames, passing bottles back and forth. It was around 9:30 when I heard it, a sharp, hard impact on the roof directly above me. The sound was unmistakable, something solid striking the wooden beams, not a branch or pine cone, something thrown. "Real mature," I muttered, assuming one of Tommy's friends was messing around. The last thing I needed was them waking Lucia after it took so long to get her down. I went back to folding clothes, but 3 minutes later, another thud hit the roof, louder this time. I froze, listening. The men's voices continued uninterrupted by the fire, their conversation and laughter showing no pause or reaction to what they'd supposedly done. With rising irritation, I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside. The October night air bit at my skin immediately. The fire blazed about 20 yards away, and I marched toward it, glancing back once to make sure the hogan door was secure. "Which one of you is throwing stuff at the roof?" I demanded, reaching the circle of men. Tommy looked up, confusion crossing his face. "What are you talking about, Maria?" "Someone threw something at the roof. Twice." I scanned their faces. "You're going to wake Lucia." Dale shook his head. "Wasn't us. We've been sitting right here the whole time." "Then who—" A third impact cut me off, loud enough that we all turned toward the hogan. This wasn't just a thud. It was a crash that seemed to shake the entire structure. "What the hell?" Tommy was on his feet now, the firelight casting his face in sharp relief. "My baby's in there." I was already running, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, I heard the scramble of boots as the men followed. I burst through the door to find Lucia awake and crying. I scooped her up, holding her tight against my chest as I scanned the ceiling. Nothing had come through, but the impact had been directly overhead. "Something hit the roof hard," Tommy said, coming in behind me. The others crowded in the doorway. "No shit," Ronnie muttered. "Sounded like someone dropped a boulder up there." Tommy grabbed the rifle my uncle kept beside the door and headed back outside. I'm going to check it out. I'll come with you, Dale said. Me too, Mike added. I stayed inside with Lucia, gently bouncing her while watching through the window as the three men circled the hogan, flashlights sweeping the ground and up toward the roof. Ronnie stood in the doorway, nervously tapping his fingers against the frame. "See anything?" he called out. "Nothing," Tommy replied, his voice tight. "No footprints, no rocks, nothing." They were halfway around the structure when it happened again, not just one impact, but a sudden barrage. It sounded like hail, except the objects striking the roof were much heavier. Impacts hammered the entire hogan, the walls, the door. Lucia screamed in my arms. "Get back inside!" Tommy yelled. The men ran for the door, ducking as if dodging invisible projectiles. As they scrambled in, we heard glass shatter outside. Tommy risked a look through the window. "Shit! They're hitting the cars, too!" Sure enough, the windshield of Tommy's Chevy was now webbed with cracks. We could hear rocks, or whatever they were, continuing to strike the vehicles parked nearby. "This is crazy," Dale whispered. "Who would do this out here? We're miles from anyone." I held Lucia tighter, feeling her tiny body trembling against mine. "It's not who," I said quietly. "It's what." They all turned to look at me. "The hell you talking about, Maria?" Tommy asked, his voice strained. Before I could answer, the barrage suddenly stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the impacts. We stood frozen, barely breathing, straining to hear any movement outside. "I'm going to check again," Tommy said, lifting the rifle. "Tommy, don't—" I started, but he was already at the door, Dale and Mike flanking him with flashlights. The three of them stepped outside cautiously. Ronnie stayed by the window watching. I rocked Lucia, who had settled into whimpering rather than outright crying. I heard their boots crunching on the hard earth as they circled again. The flashlight beams swept across the yard, illuminating the damaged vehicles and the space beyond. "There's rocks everywhere," Mike called back. "Big ones, but I don't see how anyone could have—" That's when we heard it. A scream that cut through the night like a knife. It started low, almost like a growl, then rose to a pitch that made my skin crawl. It wasn't human, couldn't be human, but it wasn't like any animal I'd heard either. It came from the direction of the Mesa, echoing across the empty land. The men outside froze in their tracks. Through the window, I saw their faces turn toward the sound, flashlights pointing uselessly into the darkness. The scream came again, closer this time. It rose and fell in a way that sounded almost like words, not English or Navajo or any language I knew, but something with intent behind it. "Get inside," I yelled. "Now!" They didn't need to be told twice. They backpedaled toward the hogan, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our small circle of safety. As they rushed through the door, slamming it behind them, I saw genuine fear on their faces. "What the fuck was that?" Ronnie whispered, his voice cracking. I swallowed hard. "The hairy one," I said, the words falling from my lips before I could stop them. Tommy's eyes snapped to mine. "Don't start with that, Maria." "You heard it," I insisted. "You all heard it." "Heard what?" Dale asked, looking between us. "What's the hairy one?" Tommy shook his head. "It's nothing, just old stories." "It's not nothing," I said. Lucia had gone quiet in my arms, eyes wide as if she too were listening. "My grandmother warned me about this place, about Shadow Mesa. She said there are things that live out here that aren't meant to be disturbed." Mike laughed nervously. "Come on, you're not talking about—" He trailed off, unable to say it. "Skinwalkers?" I finished for him. "No, something else, something older." The word hung in the air between us. Even Tommy, who usually dismissed reservation superstitions, as he called them, didn't argue. Another impact hit the roof, making us all jump. Then another and another, but lighter now, almost exploratory, as if testing our defenses. "We need to leave," I said firmly, already gathering Lucia's things. "Now." "It's pitch black out there," Dale protested. "And whatever that is, is going to get worse, I cut in. Trust me, it's testing us. It's angry we're here. This is crazy, Ronnie muttered, but he was already grabbing his jacket. Tommy hesitated, then nodded. Okay, we pack up, get to the cars and drive out together. Stay close. I worked quickly, shoving Lucia's supplies into a bag while keeping her secured against me. The tapping on the roof continued, occasionally moving to the walls or door. The sound made my teeth clench. Ready? Tommy asked, rifle in hand. The others had grabbed whatever they could use as weapons, a tire iron, a wrench, a heavy flashlight. I nodded, pulling my shawl over Lucia to shield her. On 3, Tommy said, hand on the door. 1, 2. The scream came again, so close it seemed to surround the hogan. It vibrated through the walls, through my bones. Lucia began to wail. 3! Tommy yanked the door open, and we rushed out into the darkness. The night air hit us like a physical force. The fire had died down to embers, casting barely enough light to see the outline of the cars. We ran toward them, Tommy leading the way with the rifle raised. Something moved at the edge of our vision, a shadow darker than the night sliding between the juniper trees that dotted the property. It was large, at least 7 feet tall, and it didn't move like a human. Go, go, Tommy yelled, stopping to aim the rifle. I reached his Chevy first, yanking open the back door and diving in with Lucia. Dale scrambled into the driver's seat of his truck, with Ronnie right behind him. Mike headed for Tommy's car, jumping into the driver's seat. "Tommy!" I screamed. "Come on!" He fired a shot into the darkness, the sound cracking across the empty land. Then he turned and ran for the car, throwing himself into the passenger seat. "Drive!" he shouted. Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. Dale's truck was already pulling away, headlights cutting through the darkness. As we began to move, something huge slammed into the side of the car. The whole vehicle rocked, metal denting inward. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of something I still struggled to describe. A mass of darkness, with eyes that reflected red in the faint light. Not animal eyes, not human either. Mike floored it. We fish-tailed on the dirt, then shot forward toward the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw movement at the Hogan, a silhouette climbing onto the roof, then standing upright to its full height. The scream followed us, fading only as we hit the main road and accelerated toward Gallup. No one spoke. The only sounds were Lucia's quieting sobs, our heavy breathing, and the hum of the engine pushing its limits. Tommy kept looking back, knuckles white around the rifle still clutched in his hands. We drove straight to the Turquoise Motel on the edge of town. Dale and Ronnie were already there, pacing in the parking lot. We took 2 rooms and sat in one with the lights on and the TV blaring until dawn broke. We never talked about what we saw or heard. Not that night, not the next day, as we drove back to Albuquerque in silence, and not in the 20 years that followed. Tommy and I stayed together, raised Lucia, and built a life that never acknowledged what happened at Shadow Mesa. But I knew, and he knew. Sometimes I'd catch him looking toward the western horizon, toward Gallup and the land beyond, a question in his eyes that he never asked aloud. And when Lucia was 7 and told us about the tall man with no face she'd seen in her dreams, Tommy left the room and didn't come back until morning. I never returned to my uncle's Hogan. When he died 5 years later, Tommy handled the arrangements. Whatever lives at Shadow Mesa is still there, waiting in the darkness. Some nights when the wind blows from the west, I think I can hear it scream, a reminder that some parts of this land have never been ours, and some stories are better left untold. But I've told it now, because Lucia has a daughter of her own, and yesterday she mentioned taking her family camping near Gallup next month. I'll tell her my car broke down or I'm sick, anything to keep them away from that place, away from the hairy one and its stone-throwing rage. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, Some lands aren't meant to be visited, and some memories, no matter how deeply buried, never truly fade away. Story 6. The old Chevy's tires hummed against the narrow pavement as I steered through McAfee National Forest. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the road that stretched like fingers between the towering pines. My 3 kids were unusually quiet in the back seat, tired from our day at Lake Asahi. Mariah, my oldest at 12, had her forehead pressed against the window, half asleep. 8-year-old Dylan played with his Game Boy, the electronic beeps punctuating the silence. And then there was Katie, just 6, kneeling backward on her seat, despite my repeated warnings, watching the forest roll by through the rear window. "Mama!" Katie's voice cut through the car's quiet. "There's something over there!" I glanced in the rearview mirror at her excited face. "What is it, honey? A deer?" "No, it's a white, huge thing," she pointed frantically. "By the trees!" I slowed the car, more to humor her than anything else. We'd seen plenty of wildlife that summer of 2006. Elk, deer, even a black bear once. The kids still talked about that bear. "Where?" Dylan asked, suddenly interested, dropping his game onto the seat. "Over there!" Katie insisted. "It's standing up!" I pulled onto the narrow shoulder and shifted into park. The engine idled roughly. I'd been meaning to get it checked in Gallup, but hadn't found the time between shifts at the hospital. "I don't see anything," Mariah said, now fully awake and peering out her window. I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned to look where Katie was pointing. The tree line ran parallel to the road, maybe 200 yards away, across an open meadow. That's when I saw it. Against the darkening green of the pines stood something tall and pale. At first, I thought it might be a dead tree trunk, stripped of bark, but it was too uniform, too straight, and then it moved, just slightly, a subtle shift of weight. "See it, Mama," Katie whispered. "Yeah, baby, I see it." My mouth felt suddenly dry. We sat there watching for maybe 30 seconds. The figure remained motionless, a white pillar against the forest backdrop. It was hard to judge its size from this distance, but it was tall, at least 7 or 8 feet. "Is it a person?" Dylan asked. "I don't think so," I said slowly. Maybe it's someone wrapped in something white." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin. And who would be standing out here miles from any trailhead just watching the road? "Let's go," Mariah said suddenly. "I don't like it." I put the car in drive and eased back onto the road, moving slowly. The kids kept their eyes fixed on the white figure. "Mom, it's moving!" Dylan yelled. I glanced over. The white shape was indeed moving, walking parallel to our car, keeping pace with our slow crawl down the road. "It's following us," Katie said, her voice a mix of fear and excitement. "It's just walking the same direction," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Probably heading somewhere." But when I braked to a stop, the figure stopped too. A chill ran up my spine. This wasn't coincidence. We started driving again, and immediately it resumed walking. "It's copying us," Dylan said, his face pressed against the glass. We repeated this strange dance 2 more times, stopping, then starting again, the white figure mirroring our movements exactly. The kids had gone from scared to oddly entertained. "It's playing with us," Katie giggled. "I think it's just messing around," Dylan agreed. Only Mariah remained silent, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. The sun was sinking faster now, the forest growing darker by the minute. I made a decision and pulled the car over once more, this time cutting the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy around us. "What are you doing?" Mariah asked, tension in her voice. "Just watching," I said. "Let's see what it does." What it did was unexpected. The white figure stopped when we did, standing still for maybe a minute. Then it moved, not toward us, but toward a small herd of cattle grazing in the meadow between the road and the forest. I hadn't even noticed the cattle before, about a dozen of them scattered across the grass. "Look, it's going to the cows," Katie whispered. I expected the cattle to scatter, to run from this strange intruder, but they didn't react at all. They continued grazing peacefully as the white figure moved among them. It was like they couldn't see it or were completely accustomed to its presence. "That's weird," Dylan said. "Why aren't they scared?" I didn't have an answer. The white figure weaved between the cattle, who paid it no mind, then headed toward a dense patch of trees and brush. A wooden sign next to that area read, "Whispering Pines Clearing." "It's gone," Katie said as the figure disappeared into the foliage. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Okay, time to go. We still have about 40 minutes until we get home, and it'll be dark soon." I reached for the ignition but stopped when Katie gasped. "Mom!" Her voice was sharp with fear. "It's there!" My head snapped up. The white figure was now standing on the road ahead of us, maybe 50 yards away. It had somehow crossed the 200 yards from the forest, circled around, and placed itself directly in our path, without any of us seeing it move. My heart lurched in my chest. This was impossible. No person or animal could move that quickly and silently. "How did it get there?" Mariah's voice cracked. The figure stood completely still in the middle of the road. In the dying light, I could make out more details. It was definitely humanoid, with 2 arms and 2 legs, but the proportions were wrong. Its limbs too long, its torso too narrow. Its skin or covering was a flat, chalky white that seemed to absorb the shadows rather than reflect light. And its face. I still can't describe what I saw, or thought I saw. It wasn't featureless, but the features weren't right. They weren't where they should be, or they shifted when I tried to focus on them. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gear shift into drive. "Seat belts!" I shouted. "Now!" I hit the gas, tires spinning on the pavement. For one terrible moment I thought I would have to drive straight at the thing, but at the last second I swerved onto the shoulder, half on the dirt, half on the road. As we shot past, I couldn't help but look. The figure's head turned, following our movement, but the rest of its body remained perfectly still. I caught a glimpse of eyes, dark hollows in that pale face, and then we were past it. "Don't look back!" I yelled when I saw Dylan turning in his seat. "Just face forward, everyone face forward." I pushed the old Chevy as hard as it would go, the speedometer needle climbing past 60 on that narrow, winding road. The forest blurred around us, darkness falling faster now, the shadows deepening between the trees. "Mama, is it following us?" Katie's voice was small, frightened. "No, baby, we're going too fast." I didn't know if that was true, but I needed it to be. I checked the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see that white shape in the middle of the road behind us, or worse, somehow keeping pace with our car. The road remained empty, but that did little to calm my racing heart. 10 minutes passed, then 20, the sky darkened completely, and I finally had to slow down. The headlights carved a narrow path through the night, illuminating the pavement and nothing else. The forest pressed in around us, a solid wall of blackness. "What was that thing?" Dylan finally asked, breaking the tense silence. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Some kind of animal, maybe." "It wasn't an animal," Mariah said. "Animals don't stand like that, or move like that." She was right. No animal I knew of could move from one position to another that quickly without being seen. And the way it had mimicked our movements, stopping when we stopped, moving when we moved, that suggested intelligence, purpose. "Maybe it was a person playing a prank," I offered weakly, "in the middle of nowhere." Mariah scoffed. "And how did it get ahead of us so fast?" I had no answer for that. Katie had started crying softly in the back seat. I reached back and squeezed her knee. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're safe now. We'll be home soon." But I didn't feel safe. Every shadow on the roadside looked like a tall white figure. Every rustle in the trees sounded like something moving parallel to our car, just out of sight. This wasn't my first strange experience in the forests around Gallup. There had been other things over the years. Unexplained lights in the sky one night when I was driving home from a late shift. The time I'd gone hiking with the kids and found a perfect circle of dead vegetation with no apparent cause. The strange sounds that sometimes echoed through the canyons, not quite animal, not quite human. But this was different. This was direct, personal. Whatever that thing was, it had seen us, noticed us, interacted with us, and that made it far more terrifying than distant lights or strange sounds. We reached the main highway, and I felt some of the tension leave my body. There were other cars here, other people. Streetlights illuminated the intersections. The normal world had reasserted itself. By the time we pulled into our driveway in Gallup, the kids had calmed down. Katie had fallen asleep, her cheeks still damp with tears. Dylan was back to his Game Boy, though he played with the volume off, as if afraid to break the silence. Only Mariah remained alert, her eyes scanning the darkness outside the car windows. I carried Katie inside, while the other two gathered their things from the lake trip. Once inside, I locked the door and checked all the windows. A pointless ritual, I knew. If that thing could move the way it did, no lock would keep it out. But it made me feel better. That night, all three kids slept in my bed. We didn't talk about what we'd seen, but it hung in the air between us, unspoken but present. I lay awake long after they'd fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, replaying the encounter in my mind. The white figure standing in the tree line, the way it had mirrored our movements, its strange interaction with the cattle, and most disturbing of all, its sudden appearance ahead of us on the road. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe it was some kind of rare albino elk, though that wouldn't explain its humanoid shape or behavior. Maybe it was a person in some kind of costume or protective gear, though that wouldn't explain how they moved so quickly or why they'd be out there alone. Over the next few weeks, I asked around town if anyone else had seen something strange in McAfee National Forest. Most people just gave me odd looks, but an elderly Navajo man at the gas station went quiet when I described what we'd seen. "Whispering Pines?" he asked, his weathered face suddenly serious. I nodded. "Near there, yes." He shook his head slowly. "Bad place. Old stories there. Things that watch from the trees." He wouldn't say more, no matter how I pressed him. I haven't taken that road through McAfee since that day. We go the long way around now, adding 30 minutes to our drive to the lake. The kids don't complain. None of us have talked about what we saw, at least not with each other. But I notice how they watch the tree lines when we drive, how they tense up when we pass forests. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the house at night, I find myself looking out the windows into the darkness beyond, searching for a tall white figure standing perfectly still, watching, waiting. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that whatever we saw that day is confined to the deep forest, far from our home in town. But then I remember how quickly it moved, how it appeared ahead of us on the road without being seen. And I wonder, if it wanted to, could it find us here? Does it remember us the way we remember it? And sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I swear I catch a glimpse of something pale moving between the houses across the street. Something tall and thin that stops when I look directly at it, only to vanish when I blink. But that's just my imagination. It has to be. Story 7. I remember that day like it happened yesterday, not 15 years ago, September 12, 2009, one of those perfect late summer days in New Mexico where the heat starts backing off, but winter's still a long way out. The sky was that impossible blue you only get at higher elevations, stretching forever above the pine-covered slopes of the Zuni Mountains. My boyfriend Kyle and I had been dating about 8 months. He drove a beat-up Chevy Silverado that burned oil like crazy, but could handle the rutted dirt roads that cut through McAfee National Forest better than my Civic ever could. We both worked at the lumber mill in Gallup, and with matching days off, we'd often take drives into the mountains, partly to escape the dust and noise of town, partly because we were young and restless. "Let's try that back road that cuts over to Summit Overlook," I suggested after we'd finished our packed lunch at a roadside picnic area. "Jenna at work says the view is incredible." Kyle nodded, mouth full of the last bite of his sandwich. He crumpled the wrapper, tossed it in our trash bag, and fired up the truck. "Summit Overlook it is, Becca." I hated when he called me Becca instead of Rebecca, but I let it slide. The day was too perfect to bicker. The road to Summit Overlook wasn't on most tourist maps. It snaked up through dense pine forest before emerging near the mountain's peak. Kyle drove carefully, both hands on the wheel as we bounced over ruts and rocks. The truck's suspension groaned in protest on particularly bad stretches. "This better be worth it," he muttered after a particularly jarring bump nearly caused him to hit his head on the roof. "It will be," I assured him, though I had no idea if that was true. An hour of slow driving brought us to Summit Overlook. Kyle parked the truck in a small clearing surrounded by scrubby pines. The viewpoint lived up to its name. We stepped out into the warm afternoon air and walked to the edge where the mountain fell away dramatically, revealing a panorama of valleys and ridges stretching to the horizon. "Damn," Kyle whispered, standing beside me. Jenna wasn't lying. "It's beautiful," I agreed. We stood there for several minutes, just taking it in. The silence was complete, except for the occasional call of a bird and the soft whisper of wind through the pines. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, feeling the sun on my face. That's when everything changed. The first thing I noticed was the smell. One moment I was breathing clean mountain air with the pleasant scent of sun-warmed pine, and the next I was hit by something so foul it made my stomach clench. The odor flooded my nostrils, rotting meat mixed with skunk spray, but worse somehow, more primal. My eyes snapped open. "Do you smell that?" I asked Kyle, my voice coming out higher than normal. He nodded, his face scrunched up in disgust. "What the hell is that? Dead animal?" "I don't know." I glanced around, suddenly uneasy. The Overlook no longer felt peaceful. It felt exposed. "Let's get back in the truck," Kyle suggested, and I didn't argue. We retreated to the Silverado, but left the windows down. The smell was still there, but slightly less overwhelming inside the vehicle. Kyle rested his hands on the steering wheel, but didn't start the engine. I noticed his knuckles were white. "Should we go?" I asked. "Just wait a minute," he replied, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Want to make sure it's not a bear or something before we move." That made sense, but the smell didn't. I'd encountered bear odor before on camping trips, and this wasn't it. This was wrong. Minutes ticked by. The bird calls had stopped completely. No rustling in the underbrush, no wind in the trees. Just that oppressive, waiting silence that falls over the woods when something dangerous is nearby. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. "Kyle," I whispered, not knowing why I was keeping my voice down. "Let's go." He nodded slowly, still staring out the windshield. "Yeah, this is—" A sound cut him off. Rocks tumbling down the mountainside somewhere in the distance. Not just pebbles, but the crash of something heavy, like boulders being dislodged. Kyle reached for the ignition. Before he could turn the key, it happened. A growl erupted from directly behind our truck, not the huffing grunt of a bear or the snarl of a mountain lion. I'd heard both before while camping in these mountains. This was different. Lower, almost like a sigh, but with a guttural quality that raised every hair on my body. It seemed to start deep and rise slowly in pitch before cutting off abruptly. I froze, my hand instinctively grabbing Kyle's arm. He was completely still, the key halfway to the ignition. The growl came again, closer this time. I could feel it vibrating in my chest. My skin prickled with goosebumps as cold fear washed over me. Whatever was making that sound was big, too big. Kyle finally moved, jamming the key into the ignition and starting the truck in one fluid motion. The engine roared to life, sounding impossibly loud in the unnatural silence. "Go," I said, my voice barely audible. "I am," Kyle replied, his words clipped. "But I can't just floor it here." He was right. The clearing at Summit Overlook was littered with sharp rocks that could easily puncture a tire or damage the undercarriage. We needed intact tires to make it back down the mountain. Kyle shifted into drive and began moving as quickly as he safely could, carefully navigating around the larger obstacles. I stared straight ahead, afraid to look in the side mirror. The truck inched forward, seeming to move in slow motion. Another crash of rocks sounded from somewhere behind us, closer this time. I bit my lip hard enough to taste blood. "Almost clear," Kyle muttered, more to himself than to me. The truck finally reached the dirt road leading back down the mountain. Kyle accelerated, the back tires spinning briefly before finding purchase. We lurched forward, picking up speed on the downward slope. I finally dared to look in the side mirror, but saw only dust rising behind us. No shape pursuing us from the trees, no monster from a nightmare, just empty road and swirling dust. We drove in complete silence for 20 minutes, bouncing hard over ruts and rocks, neither of us speaking. My heart rate slowly returned to normal, but the feeling of dread remained, lodged somewhere deep in my stomach. Eventually Kyle broke the silence. "What was that smell?" he asked, his voice deliberately casual, as if we were discussing the weather. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "And that sound—" he started, then stopped. "Yeah," I said, understanding his reluctance to discuss it further. That was the last we spoke of it that day. When we reached the paved road that would take us back to Gallup, Kyle pulled over and got out to check the truck for damage. Finding none, he climbed back in, reached over, and squeezed my hand once before putting the truck in gear. "Let's get some ice cream in town," he suggested, and just like that, we pretended everything was normal. But it wasn't. Not really. The next few days passed in a strange haze. I went to work at the mill, chatted with co-workers, watched TV with Kyle in the evenings at his apartment. But part of my mind remained on that mountaintop, replaying those moments over and over. The smell, the silence, that growl that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly through my bones. I did some research online, looking up local wildlife, trying to find an explanation. Bears, mountain lions, wolves. None of them made sounds like what we'd heard. I found forums where hunters and hikers shared strange experiences in the backcountry, but nothing matched what had happened at Summit Overlook. A week after our encounter, I tried bringing it up with Kyle while we were eating takeout Chinese at my small rental house. "Do you ever think about what happened up on the mountain?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Kyle's chopsticks paused halfway to his mouth. He set them down carefully on the edge of his plate. "No," he said flatly, "and I don't want to talk about it." "But don't you think we should—" "Rebecca," he cut me off, using my full name for emphasis. "Some things are better left alone. Whatever that was, it's still up there, and we're down here. Let's keep it that way." I didn't push. Kyle had grown up in Gallup, unlike me, who'd moved there just 2 years earlier for the mill job. His grandmother was half Navajo, and though he never talked much about it, I knew he respected the old beliefs. If he didn't want to discuss what we'd encountered, he probably had his reasons, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The growl haunted my dreams, turning them to nightmares where I was alone on that mountaintop, the sound coming closer as darkness fell. I'd wake up gasping, sheets twisted around my legs, the phantom smell of decay in my nostrils. 3 weeks after the incident, I ran into Tom Blackhorse at the grocery store. Tom was in his 70s, a retired forest ranger who'd spent 40 years patrolling McAfee National Forest. We'd met at a community barbecue the previous summer and had chatted about hiking trails. On impulse, I decided to ask him about Summit Overlook. "Oh, you mean Whisper Ridge," he corrected me, leaning on his shopping cart. "That's what the locals called it before the Forest Service renamed it in the 60s. Whisper Ridge?" I repeated, something cold settling in my stomach. "Why'd they call it that?" Tom shrugged. "Stories. You know how it is in small towns. Some say they hear whispers up there when the wind blows right. Others say it's a bad place, especially after dark." He gave me a curious look. "Why do you ask?" I hesitated, then decided to be partially honest. "I was up there recently. It felt strange." Tom nodded slowly. "Wouldn't be the first to say so. My grandfather used to tell me to stay away from that ridge. Said something lived up there that wasn't meant to be disturbed." He chuckled, but there wasn't much humor in it. Course, that could just be old Navajo stories meant to keep kids from wandering too far. "Did he ever say what lived there?" I pressed. Tom studied me for a long moment. He called it the one who stands upright. Never explained what he meant, and I knew better than to ask. He straightened up, wincing slightly at what was probably arthritis pain. "Anyway, that's just old stories. Probably nothing to it." But the way he quickly changed the subject told me he wasn't as dismissive of those stories as he pretended to be. Kyle and I broke up 2 months later. It wasn't because of what happened on the mountain, at least not directly. But the incident had created a wall between us, an experience we shared but couldn't discuss. We gradually drifted apart, and when he took a job at a different mill in Arizona, neither of us fought very hard to maintain the relationship. I stayed in Gallup. Sometimes I thought about leaving, starting fresh somewhere new, but something kept me there. Not just my job or the small circle of friends I'd made, but a need to understand what had happened that day. Over the years, I collected stories, never asking directly about Summit Overlook or Whisper Ridge, but listening when locals talked about strange experiences in the mountains. A hunter who came back from a weekend trip and burned all his gear without explanation. A family who abandoned their campsite in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. Hikers who reported feeling watched, smelling something foul, hearing rocks tumble when there was no one else around. I never went back to Summit Overlook. Part of me wanted confirmation that what I'd experienced was real. But the larger part, the part that still woke up some nights with that growl echoing in my head, knew better than to return. Some might find it strange that I've stayed in Gallup all these years, living in the shadow of whatever lurks in those mountains. But I've always been drawn to the unexplained. As a child, I saw my first ghost. My grandfather standing at the foot of my bed a week after his funeral. In high school, I watched strange lights hover over our farm in Kentucky, performing maneuvers no aircraft could manage. During a road trip through Arizona, something that looked almost human, but moved all wrong, crossed the highway in front of our car, its eyes reflecting our headlights like a deer's but much higher off the ground. The incident at Whisper Ridge was just one more encounter in a lifetime of brushes with the unexplained. But it was different somehow, more immediate, more threatening. The others had been glimpses into something beyond normal experience. The thing on the mountain felt like it had been looking back at me, assessing, deciding. I still drive the back roads around Gallup sometimes, though never that particular one. I still hike the lower trails of McAfee National Forest, though never alone and never too far from civilization. Occasionally, when the wind is right, I catch a whiff of something on the breeze that makes me freeze in my tracks. Just a hint of that decay and skunk odor that flooded my nostrils that day. A reminder that whatever we encountered is still out there, moving through those ancient pine forests, watching from ridgelines, reminding us that for all our maps and trails and overlooks, we don't really know these mountains at all. Some nights, standing on the porch of my small house on the outskirts of town, I look toward the dark outline of the Zuni Mountains against the star-filled sky. I think about Kyle, wonder if he ever thinks about what we heard, if it visits his dreams the way it still visits mine. I think about Tom Blackhorse, who passed away 3 years ago, taking whatever else he knew about the one who stands upright to his grave. And sometimes, very rarely, when the night is especially still, I swear I can hear it. That distinctive rustic growl carrying across miles of darkness, starting low and rising before cutting off abruptly. A sound that doesn't belong to any animal I know, echoing from Whisper Ridge. A sound that says, I'm still here. Story 8. The night air hit different that Friday. Hot and sticky, like Oklahoma summers get, but with something else in it. A warning, maybe. I didn't catch it then. Lance and I had just finished our shift at Boiling Springs State Park, picking up trash and clearing trails. My muscles ached from 8 hours of labor, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that made cold beer sound like heaven. "Hey, you want to head down to the river?" Lance asked, jingling his truck keys. "Got a cooler of Coors in the back." I nodded, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Sounds perfect." Lance's old Ford F-150 rumbled to life as we pulled away from the park. The dashboard clock read 9:47 p.m. The roads through Blaine County were empty, just how we liked them. We'd grown up here, knew every bend, every patch of dirt. Nothing ever happened in our corner of Oklahoma. At least that's what I thought back then. We turned down the gravel access road that led to our favorite spot by the Cimarron River. The headlights carved through darkness as rocks crunched under the tires. Lance parked facing east, toward the water, and cut the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the distant sound of the river and night insects. "Hand me one," I said, as Lance reached into the cooler. The beer was cold against my palm. We sat with the windows down, watching moonlight ripple across the water about 200 yards ahead. Between us and the river stretched an open field, then a line of trees marking the riverbank. Lance took a long drink and sighed. "Man, Carl was being a real ass today, making us re-rake those campsites." I nodded, half listening. Something white-gray moved in the distance, catching my eye. Lance saw it too. "What the hell is that?" "Probably a horse from the Peterson place," I said, squinting. "Looks like it got loose." The figure moved with speed across the field, running parallel to the river. Even in the moonlight, something seemed off. It wasn't moving like a horse. Too upright. Too deliberate. "That ain't no horse," Lance muttered, setting his beer down. I watched as the figure reached the tree line and disappeared. "Deer, maybe. Awful big, though." Lance leaned forward against the steering wheel. "Too tall for a deer. You see how it was moving?" I nodded slowly. Whatever it was stood taller than any deer I'd ever seen. The image burned into my mind, the way it ran, almost loping with a strange sideways motion. We sat quiet for a minute, both staring at the spot where it vanished. Then I heard it, a sharp crack from the tree line. "You hear that?" I whispered. Lance nodded, his face suddenly serious. Another crack followed, louder this time, then another, branches breaking. Something big was moving through the trees. The sounds got louder, closer. Whatever was in there was heading straight toward us. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs as each snap and crash grew nearer. 20 yards away, then 10, then silence. Complete, sudden silence. Lance's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. "Where'd it go?" I shook my head, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Lance glanced at the side mirror, then froze. His face went slack, drained of color in the blue dashboard light. Oh, Jesus! I turned to look at him. What? He just stared at the mirror. When I followed his gaze, my blood turned to ice water. Behind our truck, illuminated in the moonlight, stood something impossible. A figure, massive and still, at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8. It had emerged from the trees on our right, somehow circling behind us without making a sound. "Don't move," Lance whispered, his voice cracking. "Just don't fucking move." The thing stood about 15 feet behind the tailgate. From the side mirror, I could see its silhouette clearly in the moonlight. It wasn't human, not even close. Its arms hung unnaturally long, down to its knees. No neck separated its broad shoulders from its head, which rose to a strange, conical point. Its entire body appeared covered in hair that caught the moonlight, giving it a shimmering quality. For 30 seconds, that felt like hours. Nobody moved. Not us. Not it. I could hear Lance's breathing, shallow and fast. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple. Then it shifted its weight. 1 foot forward, a deliberate step. "Start the truck," I hissed. Lance didn't respond, just stared transfixed in the mirror. "Lance," I grabbed his arm. "Start the fucking truck!" The creature took another step toward us, then another, faster now. "It's coming," I said, panic rising in my throat. "Lance, it's coming!" Lance fumbled for the keys, dropping them between his legs. I reached into the glove compartment, where I knew he kept his .44 Magnum. My fingers closed around the cold metal grip as the creature broke into a charge. I thrust the gun out the window and aimed it behind us. "Stop!" I screamed. "I'll shoot!" Lance finally got the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the creature closed half the distance to our truck. "Go!" I yelled, still pointing the gun backward. The tires spun in dirt before catching. We lurched forward as Lance floored it. In the red glow of the taillights, I caught a clear glimpse of the thing's face. Heavy brow ridge, deep-set eyes, not human eyes, not animal eyes either. Something else entirely. Its massive hand reached for the tailgate, fingertips just brushing the metal as we pulled away. Lance drove like a madman down the gravel road, dust billowing behind us. I kept the gun trained out the window, watching the darkness behind us. "Did you see that?" Lance's voice shook. "Did you fucking see that?" "Just drive," I said, my own voice strange in my ears. "Don't stop." We didn't speak again until we hit the highway. Lance pulled over at a gas station, killed the engine, and stared straight ahead. "What was that?" he finally asked. I shook my head. "I don't know." "Bullshit," he said, turning to me. "You saw it. That was a goddamn Bigfoot." The word hung in the air between us. Saying it made it real somehow. "It couldn't be," I said, but I knew he was right. "Arms down to its knees," Lance said, gesturing. "That face. Jesus Christ, that face." I put the gun back in the glove compartment with shaking hands. "Nobody's going to believe us." "I don't care who believes us," Lance said. "I know what I saw." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing illuminated in the red taillights, reaching for us. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was some kind of bear, standing on its hind legs. A rational explanation, but Lance wasn't having it. "We need to go back," he said when he picked me up the next day. "Find tracks or something." "You're out of your mind," I told him. "Don't you want to know for sure?" I did, and I didn't. Part of me needed proof, needed to confirm I wasn't crazy. Another part wanted to forget the whole thing. "I'll bring the .44, Lance said, "and my hunting rifle. We'll go in daylight." I shook my head. "I'm not going back there." Lance stared at me for a long moment. "Fine. I'll ask Teddy." Teddy Wilson was Lance's hunting buddy. He'd believe anything if it meant a chance to shoot something. They went without me the next day. Came back with nothing. No tracks, no hair, no proof. The ground was too hard from the summer drought, Lance said. But I knew the real reason. That thing, whatever it was, didn't want to be found. Lance tried to get me to go back a few more times over the next couple weeks. I refused every time. The thought of standing in that spot again made my stomach churn. "You're being a pussy," Lance said after my third refusal. "It's probably long gone by now." "Then what's the point of going?" I countered. Lance couldn't answer that. I think he needed to face it again, to prove to himself he could. I didn't need that. I'd seen enough. 2 months passed. Lance stopped asking me to go back to the river. We didn't talk about what happened that night, but it changed things between us, and it changed me. I quit my job at the state park. Couldn't stand being in the woods anymore. Got work at the hardware store in town instead. 4 walls, fluorescent lights, concrete floors. No shadows, no rustling leaves, no unexpected movements in my peripheral vision. Lance thought I was overreacting. "It was one thing, one time," he said. "You can't let it run you off like this." But it wasn't just about seeing the creature. It was about what it meant. All my life I'd thought I understood the world. There were things that existed and things that didn't. Now that line was blurred. If that thing could exist without most people knowing, what else was out there? I started locking my doors at night, installed better porch lights, bought my own gun. People noticed the change in me. My mom asked if I was in some kind of trouble. My girlfriend at the time, Stacy, said I seemed distracted, always looking over my shoulder. "Something happened to you," she said one night as we sat on her porch, "and you won't tell me what it is." How could I? She'd think I was crazy. Hell, sometimes I thought I was crazy. Maybe Lance and I had seen a bear, or even a man in some kind of costume. Maybe the stress and the heat and the beer had warped our perceptions, but then I'd remember those eyes in the taillights, the impossible length of those arms, the silence of its movement until it wanted to be heard. Lance adjusted better than I did. He still worked at the park, still hunted, still fished, but he carried his gun more often. And sometimes I'd catch him staring into the trees with a different kind of awareness. "You ever told anyone?" I asked him about 6 months after it happened. We were sitting on his porch, something we did less and less these days. Lance took a swig of beer and shook his head. "Teddy thinks I'm just hunting Bigfoot for fun," he said. "Didn't tell him what we saw." "Why not?" Lance looked at me. "Would you believe it if you hadn't seen it yourself?" He had a point. "I went back there last week," Lance said quietly. I stiffened. "Alone?" He nodded. "Middle of the day. Brought both guns." "And?" "Nothing." Lance stared at his beer bottle, but it felt like I was being watched the whole time. I believed him. That feeling of being watched, I'd had it ever since that night, even in town, even in broad daylight. "I don't think we should go back there," I said. Lance nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right." But I knew he would. Lance couldn't let it go. He needed to understand, to confront. I just needed to forget. Years passed. I moved to Tulsa, got a job in construction. Lance stayed in Blaine County. We drifted apart the way friends do. But every few months he'd call, always with the same question, "Remember that night?" As if I could forget. In 2005, Lance called to tell me he'd joined some Bigfoot research group. They went on expeditions, recorded weird sounds in the woods, looked for tracks. He never told them about our encounter, said he was saving that story. "For what?" I asked. "For when I find proof," he said. "Then they'll have to believe me." I moved on with my life, got married, had kids. Told myself that night was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But I never went camping again, never took my kids hiking. My wife thought I was just a city person now. I let her believe that. In 2018, 20 years after that night, Lance called me out of the blue. "They found footprints," he said, his voice excited, "up in Washington State, 16 inches long, just like what we saw." I'd heard about Bigfoot evidence before. Always turned out to be hoaxes or mistakes. "That's great, Lance," I said, not wanting to get into it. "I'm going up there next month," he continued, "with the research group. We're going to find it this time." I wished him luck and hung up. My hands shook slightly as I set the phone down. 20 years, and the memory still had power over me. That night, I dreamed of the river, of red taillights illuminating a face not meant to be seen, of long arms reaching. I woke up gasping, my wife stirring beside me. "Bad dream," she murmured. "Yeah," I said, "just a bad dream." But it wasn't. It was a memory. And memories don't go away, no matter how hard you try to forget them. I've made my peace with it mostly. I don't think about that night every day anymore. Sometimes weeks or months will pass without it crossing my mind. But I know it's always there, waiting in the corners of my consciousness. Lance is still searching, still hoping to prove what we saw was real. I don't need proof. I know what I saw. I know what's out there. And I know now that the world is bigger and stranger than most people will ever understand. There are things in the dark spaces of this country that don't have names, that don't want to be found. Sometimes I think about going back to that spot by the river, just to see it in daylight, to stand where it stood and maybe understand why it was there, what it wanted. But I won't. Some doors once opened can't be closed again. I've glimpsed what's on the other side. That's enough for one lifetime. Story 9. I sat with my back against the cold stone wall, the worn edges digging into my jacket. The air held that sharp chill that comes with New Hampshire autumn evenings. My rifle rested across my lap, fingers idly tracing the smooth metal of the barrel. Dad had set up about 50 yards away, giving us both space to watch different sections of the field. This was our third hunting season together, and I felt the weight of being 14, trusted with a weapon and my own watch. The sun had started its descent behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the open field near the University of New Hampshire dairy farm. Most hunters pack it in when dusk approaches, but Dad always said that's when the deer get bold. "Patience, Cody," he'd told me 100 times. "That's what separates the hunters from the hikers." I pulled my orange cap lower, fighting the urge to check my watch again. The woods had fallen into that peculiar silence that sometimes happens at dusk, like everything's holding its breath. No birds, no squirrels, just the occasional rustle of leaves from the breeze. Then I heard it. Movement in the woods directly behind me. At first I thought deer, that soft, deliberate stepping of hooves on the forest floor. But this sounded heavier, more purposeful. The footfalls pressed deep into the fallen leaves with a weight that didn't match any whitetail I'd ever tracked. I slowly turned my head, keeping my body still against the wall. The stone bit into my shoulder blades as I twisted to look over the top of the wall into the darkening forest. Nothing at first, just trees and shadows and the growing darkness between them. Then movement caught my eye, something large shifting between two thick pines about 30 yards back. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It stepped forward, and my heart slammed against my ribs. Standing there, partially obscured by a maple tree, was what looked like a man, but not a man. It stood upright on 2 legs, but everything else was wrong. It was tall, easily 6.5, maybe 7 feet, covered in dark brown hair or fur that hung in matted clumps from its massive frame. The shoulders stretched impossibly wide, maybe twice the width of my dad's, who was no small man himself. I couldn't breathe. My fingers clenched around my rifle, but I couldn't move to lift it. The thing, because that's all I could think to call it, hadn't seen me yet. It moved with a strange, rolling gait, powerful and deliberate. Each step crushed the forest floor beneath what looked like massive bare feet. Then the smell hit me, a powerful musty odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something sharper, like pine sap, but fouler, more animal. It wafted across the stone wall in waves, making my eyes water. The creature stopped and turned slightly, giving me a partial view of its profile. Its face protruded forward in a way that wasn't quite human, covered in the same dark fur as its body, with a heavy brow ridge that shadowed whatever eyes it had. In the growing darkness, I couldn't make out clear features, just the massive silhouette. It made a sound then, a low, rumbling grunt that vibrated through the air. Not a growl exactly, more like the noise someone makes clearing their throat, but deeper, more resonant. It did this twice, paused, then made the sound again. I sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The creature remained still for several seconds, then began walking again, moving parallel to the stone wall. It still hadn't noticed me, and I realized the fading light and my camo jacket probably blended me into the stones. As it moved, I could see it better. The body was massive, thick with muscle that shifted under the fur with each step. I guessed it weighed at least 300 pounds, maybe more. It walked upright, but with a slight hunch, arms hanging longer than a human's would, occasionally brushing against its thighs. The thing moved toward the edge of the woods, where the trees thinned before opening into the field. I expected it to stop at the tree line. Most forest animals do, scanning for danger before crossing open ground. But it didn't hesitate. It walked straight from the cover of the forest into the open field, still making those occasional grunting sounds. I watched, unable to look away as it crossed the open space. Its dark form stood out starkly against the pale, dying grass of the field. Each stride covered ground quickly, with purpose. It wasn't running, but it moved fast, faster than a person could walk comfortably. For what felt like forever, I sat there watching this impossible thing move across the landscape. My watch later told me it had been maybe 15 minutes, but time seemed stretched and warped in those moments. The creature eventually reached the far tree line and disappeared back into the forest. The last I saw was its broad back, melting into the darkness between the trees. Only when it vanished did I realize I'd been holding my breath. My lungs burned as I gasped for air. My hands trembled so badly I had to set my rifle down before I dropped it. Sweat had soaked through my shirt despite the cold evening air. I wanted to call out to Dad, but my voice wouldn't work. I sat there for another 5 minutes, gathering myself, trying to process what I'd just seen. Nothing in my 14 years had prepared me for this. I'd grown up with stories about Bigfoot and Sasquatch. Everyone in rural New Hampshire had. But they were just that, stories. Campfire tales to scare kids. What I'd seen wasn't a story. It was flesh and muscle and fur, moving with intent through the woods I'd known my whole life. When I finally found my voice, I called out, "Dad!" It came out as a hoarse whisper at first, then louder. "Dad!" I heard him moving toward me through the brush before I saw him, his familiar heavy tread and the occasional crack of a branch. "Cody, what's wrong?" He emerged from around the stone wall, rifle held ready but pointed down. His face, lined from years working outdoors, creased with concern. "Did you see something? Get a shot off?" "I saw..." The words stuck in my throat. How do you tell your father, a practical, no-nonsense New Hampshire man who dealt in certainties like wood and nails and hunting seasons, that you just watched Bigfoot stroll through the woods? "I saw something," I finally managed. "Not a deer. It was big, Dad. Walking on 2 legs. Dad's expression changed, hardened slightly. "A bear? We've had black bears around here before." I shook my head. It wasn't a bear. It was walking upright the whole time. Tall, taller than you, covered in dark hair. "Cody," he said slowly, "it's getting dark. Could have been a guy in dark clothes, maybe a hunter without orange." "No!" My voice came stronger now. "It wasn't human, and it wasn't a bear. It was..." I hesitated, then said it. It looked like a Bigfoot. Dad was quiet for a long moment. I expected him to laugh or lecture me about imagination and fading light playing tricks. Instead, he just looked at me, then out toward the field where I'd pointed. "Show me where it went," he said finally. I led him to the spot where the creature had emerged from the woods. Even in the fading light, the signs of passage were clear, Broken branches at a height well above Dad's head, disturbed undergrowth. The musky odor still lingered faintly in the air. "You smell that?" I asked. Dad nodded, his face unreadable. He knelt down, examining the ground at the forest edge. His fingers traced something in the soft earth, and he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. "Let's check the field," he said. We walked out into the open ground, heading in the direction I'd seen the thing move. About 20 yards in, Dad stopped abruptly. There in the soft earth of the field was a footprint, but not like any print I'd ever seen while tracking. It was huge, easily twice the size of Dad's boot, with what looked like 5 toes splayed wide. The impression was deep, suggesting tremendous weight. Dad said nothing, just moved forward, following a trail of these prints across the field. I walked beside him, my rifle now clutched tightly in my hands, eyes constantly scanning the tree line ahead. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken thoughts. The footprints continued in a straight line across the entire field, each one perfectly clear in the soft earth. When we reached the far forest edge, Dad hesitated for the first time. "It went in there?" he asked, pointing to a gap between 2 large oak trees. I nodded. "Yeah, straight in." The forest beyond looked impenetrably dark now, the sun having fully set while we tracked the prints. Dad clicked on his flashlight, its beam catching on more broken branches and disturbed ground cover. The prints continued, visible even in the dried leaves and pine needles of the forest floor. We followed them for another quarter-mile, the trail clear and unbroken. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. The forest seemed different now, threatening in a way it had never been before. Every shadow might hide that massive form. Every rustle of branches overhead might be something watching us. Dad must have felt it too. After tracking the prints for about half a mile, he stopped and switched off his flashlight. We stood in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. "That's far enough," he said quietly. "We're not going any further tonight." "But we could keep following them," I protested, though without much conviction. Part of me was relieved. Dad shook his head. "Whatever made these tracks, I don't want to meet it in the dark. We'll come back tomorrow." We didn't speak much on the walk back to the truck. Dad kept his flashlight pointed at the ground, occasionally stopping to examine something I couldn't see. His face remained thoughtful, concerned. As we loaded our gear into the truck, he finally broke the silence. "You sure about what you saw, Cody? Exactly what it looked like?" "I'm sure," I said. "It was like the Bigfoot stories, but real. Standing right there." Dad nodded slowly, starting the engine. "Those tracks were made by something big, something heavy." He paused. "Something I've never seen before, and I've hunted these woods for 30 years. We drove in silence for a while, the headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the familiar road home. Finally, Dad spoke again. "Tomorrow, we'll tell Matt Barton about this. He's game warden. Needs to know if there's something unusual in these woods." "You believe me then?" I asked. Dad gave me a long look. "I believe you saw something, and I believe those tracks were real. Beyond that," he shrugged. "I don't know what to believe, Cody, but I know you, and you're not one for making up stories." That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive figure moving through the trees, heard those deep grunts. The smell seemed to linger in my nostrils, that strange, musty coniferous odor that didn't belong to any animal I knew. I thought Dad might change his mind overnight, convince himself we'd seen bear tracks or some hunter playing a prank, but in the morning he was already dressed and ready when I came downstairs. "Eat something," he said, pushing a plate of eggs toward me. "We're meeting Matt at the dairy farm in an hour." Matt Barton had been game warden in Lee for as long as I could remember. He was a solid man, with a weathered face and the patient eyes of someone used to listening to hunters' tall tales. When we met him at the farm's entrance, he greeted Dad with a handshake and me with a nod. Tom said you boys had something unusual to report, he said, referring to the dairy farm manager who'd apparently called ahead. Said you were out tracking something last night. Dad nodded toward me. Cody saw it first. I only saw the tracks. Matt turned to me, his expression neutral. All right, Cody, tell me what you saw. I told him everything. The size, the fur, the way it walked, the sounds it made, the smell. I described how it moved through the field without hesitation and disappeared into the woods. Throughout my account, Matt listened without interruption, his face betraying nothing. When I finished, he looked at Dad. And the tracks? Like nothing I've seen before, Dad said. Too big for bear, wrong shape anyway. They go half a mile at least, maybe further. We stopped tracking when it got dark. Matt nodded. Show me. We led him to the stone wall where I'd been sitting, then to the place where the creature emerged from the woods. In the morning light, the signs of passage were even more evident. Broken branches, disturbed ground, and then the footprints in the field. Matt knelt beside one of the clearer prints, measuring it against his hand. His expression changed then, the professional neutrality giving way to genuine surprise. 15, 16 inches, he muttered, and deep. Whatever made this was heavy. He followed the tracks with us across the field and into the woods on the far side. Unlike us, he didn't stop after half a mile but kept going, following the trail deeper into the forest. Dad and I exchanged glances but continued behind him. The tracks led to a small stream, crossed it, and continued up a rocky hillside where they eventually became impossible to follow on the hard ground. Matt spent almost an hour searching for where the trail picked up again, but it was lost. As we walked back, Matt was unusually quiet. When we reached his truck, he pulled out a notebook and made some entries, then looked up at us. I'm going to file a report, he said, not specifying what made these tracks, just that there's an unidentified large animal in the area. You believe us? I asked. Matt closed his notebook. I believe in evidence, Cody. And those tracks are real. As for what made them, he shrugged. I've been warden here 15 years, seen all kinds of wildlife, all kinds of tracks, never seen anything like this. He looked at Dad. I'd keep Cody out of those woods for a while, at least until we figure out what's back there. Dad nodded. Already planned on it. As Matt drove away, Dad put his hand on my shoulder. You did good, Cody, keeping your head when you saw that thing. Not everyone would have stayed so calm. I was scared, I admitted. Being scared and staying calm anyway, that's real courage, Dad said. Now come on. Your mum's going to want to hear this story. We never did find out what made those tracks. Matt's report got filed away somewhere, and by the time we returned to the site a week later, rain had washed away most of the evidence. The few people Dad told either humored him or suggested bear, moose, or a hoax. But I know what I saw that evening in 2007, sitting against that stone wall as dusk approached. I know the size of it, the way it moved, the sound of its breathing and those low grunts. I know the smell that hung in the air after it passed, and sometimes, when I'm in the woods around Lee, I find myself scanning the trees, listening for heavy footsteps, watching for movement just beyond the tree line. Because whatever walked through that field that day is still out there somewhere, moving through the New Hampshire wilderness, leaving evidence that something unexplained shares these woods with us. Story 10. My name's Leo Harmon, and what I'm about to tell you happened in August 1997 near Wolfville, Nova Scotia. I was staying at my grandparents' place on South Mountain for the summer, helping out with their orchard and enjoying the outdoors before heading back to college in the fall. Their property backed up against about 40 acres of dense woods that stretched up the mountainside, cut through by a rocky brook that swelled after heavy rains. Growing up, I'd spent every summer at that old farmhouse. Grandpa Tom and Grandma Ellie had owned the place since the 50s, and they knew every inch of that mountain. So did most of the older folks around Wolfville. They'd warn us kids not to go too far up the brook alone, especially near dusk. "That's when the tramp comes out," Old Man Jenkins from down the road would say. "Wears nothing but animal skins, smells worse than a skunk in a garbage heap, chase you right out of there if he catches you." As kids, we called him the Brook Man and dared each other to go farther and farther upstream. None of us ever saw anything, though Bobby Turnbull swore he'd heard strange whooping sounds once. We figured it was just the old-timers trying to keep us close to home. By 22, I'd long stopped believing in the Brook Man. I'd hiked those woods hundreds of times without seeing anything stranger than a moose or the occasional black bear. The stories were just local color, the kind of things small towns everywhere keep alive to make the place seem special. That Wednesday started like any other. I woke up around 6, helped Grandpa with some fence repairs, then decided to take advantage of the cool morning to go for a hike. We'd had heavy rain the night before, which meant the brook would be running high, always an impressive sight with small waterfalls forming over the rocky steps. "Don't go too far up today," Grandpa warned as I laced my boots on the back porch. "Ground'll be slippery, and that brook gets dangerous after a big rain." "I'll be careful," I promised, pocketing the Swiss Army knife he'd given me years ago. I grabbed my backpack with a couple sandwiches, a water bottle, and a small first aid kit, then headed out. The morning air felt clean and cool in my lungs as I walked the familiar path from the orchard to the tree line. The recent rain had left everything smelling of wet earth and pine. Droplets still clung to the leaves, occasionally falling onto my baseball cap or shoulders as I pushed through the underbrush toward the sound of rushing water. I reached the brook within 15 minutes. It had indeed swollen with rainwater, rushing white and powerful over the rocks. Usually just a gentle stream you could rock hop across. Today it was about 12 feet wide in spots and knee-deep. Perfect for exploring. I walked upstream for about an hour, following the brook's winding path up the mountain. The forest grew denser the further I went, with hemlocks and spruce trees growing so close together they created a permanent twilight beneath their branches. I kept to the brook's edge, sometimes walking in the shallow parts when fallen trees blocked the bank. Around mid-morning, I reached a section I hadn't visited in years. The brook narrowed here, cutting through a small ravine with steep banks on both sides. The water slowed in a deep pool before spilling over a 3-foot drop. I remembered this spot. We'd sometimes swim here as teenagers on the hottest summer days. I stopped to eat one of my sandwiches, sitting on a flat rock beside the pool. The only sounds were the rushing water, the occasional bird call and the dripping of leftover rainwater from the trees. No human noise reached here, no cars, no machinery, nothing. Just wilderness. After eating, I decided to push a little further before turning back. The ravine continued upstream, getting narrower. I had to wade through the water in spots where the banks disappeared completely. The cool water soaked through my jeans up to my thighs, but the day was warm enough that I didn't mind. About 200 yards past my lunch spot, the brook made a sharp bend around a large boulder. The water ran fast here, carving a deeper channel. I carefully picked my way around the bend, testing each step on the slippery rocks. As I rounded the corner, I stopped dead. There, about 30 feet ahead in the middle of the brook, stood what I first thought was a black bear. It was partially bent over, facing away from me, apparently fishing or drinking from the water. My heart jumped into my throat. Bear encounters weren't uncommon in Nova Scotia, but they were always dangerous. I froze, not wanting to startle it. Then it stood up, and turned around. What faced me wasn't a bear. It stood on 2 legs about 6 feet tall, shorter than I expected, but still imposing. Its body was covered in black hair, thick on the limbs, but thinner across the chest and stomach where I could see dark skin underneath. The build reminded me of a light heavyweight boxer, powerful shoulders, muscular arms that hung unnaturally long at its sides, and a barrel chest that tapered to a narrower waist. But it was the face that told me exactly what I was looking at. A pronounced brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes that stared directly into mine. The skin around the eyes, cheeks and forehead was dark and leathery, hairless except for that prominent brow. Its nose was flat against its face, with wide nostrils that flared slightly as it breathed. Below that was a wide mouth with thin lips, lighter in color than the rest of its facial skin. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the Brookman. Whatever name you want to use, I was staring right at it, and it was staring right back at me. Neither of us moved. Water rushed around its legs, which were planted firmly on the rocky brook bed. Droplets clung to the hair on its body, glistening in the dappled sunlight that broke through the trees above. Time seemed to slow down. I don't know if we looked at each other for 5 seconds or 50. My mind catalogued every detail with unnatural clarity. The way its chest expanded with each breath, the slight tilt of its head as it assessed me, the absolute lack of fear in its posture. Then, the strangest thing happened. The creature took a deep breath and released it in what I can only describe as a frustrated sigh, like I'd interrupted its morning routine and now it had to deal with me. Its shoulders dropped slightly and it shook its head, a surprisingly human gesture of annoyance. It turned away from me, moving with deliberate slowness. No sudden movements, no aggression. It simply turned and began walking upstream, occasionally glancing back as if to make sure I wasn't following. I remained frozen in place, my feet seeming to have grown roots into the rocky stream bed. The creature climbed the steep bank with easy strength, grabbing saplings to pull itself up. As it reached the top, I noticed again how unnaturally long its arms were, the wet, hairy limb hanging almost to its knee as it paused at the ridge. It looked back at me one final time, and I swear I saw something like recognition pass between us. Not that it knew me personally, but that it recognized what I was, just as I had recognized what it was. Then it disappeared into the dense undergrowth. I don't know how long I stood there after it left. My legs had locked in place, and my breathing came in short, shallow gasps. Only when a fish jumped nearby, splashing water onto my leg, did I snap out of my trance. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had vanished. Only when I rounded the bend did I turn and walk, then jog, then run, back downstream toward my grandparents' property. The journey back passed in a blur. I stumbled several times on slippery rocks, soaking myself completely when I fell into a deeper section of the brook. But I barely noticed. My mind replayed the encounter on loop, the creature's eyes, its sigh, the casual way it had simply walked away. When I finally broke through the tree line into my grandparents' orchard, the afternoon sun hit me like a spotlight. The normal world felt too bright, too ordinary after what I'd just experienced. I could see Grandpa in the distance, working on his tractor near the barn. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it hours earlier. I staggered to the back porch and collapsed into one of the wooden rocking chairs. My hands shook as I pulled out my cigarettes and tried 3 times to light one with my waterlogged lighter. When I finally succeeded, I inhaled deeply, trying to steady myself. That's when the delayed fear hit me. My whole body began to tremble uncontrollably. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cool air. I chain-smoked 3 cigarettes, watching my hands shake as the reality of what I'd seen finally processed in my brain. I had seen a Sasquatch. The creature from campfire stories and tabloid headlines had stood 30 feet away from me, in broad daylight, looking me directly in the eyes. Grandma found me on the porch an hour later, still shaking. "Leo, you're soaked through. What happened?" She hurried over, her weathered hands touching my forehead to check for fever. "I fell in the brook," I managed to say. "Slipped on some rocks." She clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Your grandfather warned you about that. Come inside and change before you catch your death." I followed her inside mechanically. grateful she couldn't see the real reason for my distress. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, eyes wide. I looked like I'd seen a ghost, or something even less believable. That evening at dinner, I picked at my food silently while Grandpa discussed the weather forecast, and Grandma talked about her plans to make preserves from the late summer berries. "You're awful quiet tonight, Leo," Grandpa observed, studying me over his glasses. "Something on your mind?" I hesitated. In any other family with any other grandparents, I'd have kept quiet. Who would believe such a story? But my grandparents had lived on South Mountain their entire lives. They knew its secrets better than anyone. "Grandpa," I said slowly, "what do you know about the tramp that lives up by the brook?" His fork paused halfway to his mouth. He exchanged a quick glance with Grandma before returning his attention to me. "Why do you ask?" His voice was carefully neutral. "I think I saw him today." I couldn't bring myself to say Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Those words belonged to the world of tabloids and bad TV shows, not to the real experience I'd had. Grandpa set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "Describe what you saw." I told them everything, the exact location, the creature's appearance, its behavior, and how it had simply walked away. I described the strange calm I'd felt during the encounter and the delayed fear that hit me afterward. Throughout my story, neither of them interrupted or showed disbelief. When I finished, Grandpa nodded slowly. "First time I saw one, I was about your age, summer of '52. Different one than you saw. The one I encountered was bigger, older maybe, had gray in its hair. My jaw dropped. You've seen it too." "Them," he corrected. "There's more than one. Family group, I reckon. Been on this mountain longer than any of us." Grandma reached across the table and patted my hand. "My father saw them in the 20s. Called them wild men back then. Said they kept to themselves unless someone went too far up the mountain." "But why doesn't everyone know about them?" I asked. "Why aren't there scientists studying them?" Grandpa snorted. "Who says there aren't? Government fellows came around in the 70s, after Hank Milburn reported one crossing his field. They asked questions, took some plaster casts of tracks, then left. Never heard from them again." "The locals know," Grandma added. "We just don't talk about it much. What good would it do? Bring in cameras and tourists to tear up the mountain looking for them. They've lived alongside us peacefully all these years. We respect their space. They respect ours." I sat back, stunned by their matter-of-fact acceptance. "So all those warnings about the tramp or the brookman? Easier to scare kids with a human bogeyman than try to explain something most people wouldn't believe anyway," Grandpa said with a shrug. "Keeps the young ones from wandering too far and bothering them." That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the encounter in my mind. The creature's eyes haunted me. Too intelligent to be animal, too wild to be human. Something in between, something that shared our world, but lived apart from it. I never went back to that section of the brook during the rest of my stay that summer. Not out of fear exactly, but out of respect. That part of the mountain belonged to them, and I'd inadvertently trespassed. 26 years have passed since that August morning. I've told this story exactly 3 times. To my grandparents that evening, to my wife on our honeymoon, and now here. Each time I tell it, the details remain crystal clear. The rushing water, the creature's sigh, the unnaturally long arm as it climbed the bank. The brookman wasn't a tramp or a hobo in animal skins. He wasn't a legend designed to keep children close to home. He was real, flesh and blood, living in the hidden corners of a world that's become too crowded to believe in mysteries. But I know what I saw on South Mountain that day. And sometimes, on rainy nights when the wind blows through the trees outside my window, I wonder if he remembers me too. Story 11. Something moved at the edge of the clear cut. I froze, coffee mug halfway to my lips, straining to see through the early morning mist that clung to the foothills. Just a bear, I told myself. We got plenty of those around Strander Road, especially in spring when they emerged hungry from hibernation. I set my mug on the porch railing and squinted. The figure took a few lumbering steps, then paused. That's when my spine went cold. The way it moved wasn't right. Bears don't walk like that. My name's Jim Harker. It was April 1995, and I'd been living in my cabin outside Kelso for nearly 3 years. I'd chosen this spot for the solitude and the view of Mount St. Helens, which stood like a sentinel in the distance. My property backed up against a section of forest that had been clear-cut a few years back, leaving an odd patchwork of stumps and new growth. Beyond that, trails snaked their way toward the mountain, barely used except by the occasional hunter or hiker. The figure moved again, and this time there was no mistaking it. Too tall for a bear, too massive for a man. "Holy shit," I whispered, my breath visible in the cool morning air. I'd seen something like this before, years ago in Michigan. The memory had faded with time, buried under layers of doubt and ridicule. But now, as I watched the dark shape moving deliberately along the tree line, those memories crashed back with startling clarity. My camera. I needed my camera. I turned and rushed inside, nearly knocking over my coffee in my haste. My hands trembled as I yanked open the drawer where I kept my Canon with the telephoto lens. I'd bought it for wildlife photography, eagles, elk, the occasional cougar. Never imagined I'd use it for this. Back on the porch, I raised the viewfinder to my eye. Through the telephoto lens, the figure leapt into sharp focus. My breath caught in my throat. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that hung in matted clumps from its massive frame. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the arms long and powerful, hanging at its sides. It moved with a strange combination of caution and confidence, stopping occasionally to survey its surroundings. I pressed the shutter button. Nothing happened. My stomach dropped as I lowered the camera and checked it. No film. The damn thing had no film. No, I muttered, looking back up. The creature was still there, moving slowly through the scrub brush. I raised the camera again, using it like binoculars. Its face was flat and wide, with a pronounced brow ridge that shadowed deep-set eyes. The nose was broad and flat, the jaw heavy. Not a mask, not a costume. This was a living, breathing thing moving through my back 40 with purpose. A Bigfoot, right there in front of me. I watched, transfixed, as it moved along the edge of the tree line. It paused at one point, stooping to examine something on the ground. I could see the muscles in its back shift under the hair as it reached down. When it straightened, it appeared to be holding something small in its massive hand. It brought the object close to its face, examined it, then tossed it aside. After about 5 minutes, it turned and looked in my direction. I ducked instinctively, though I was a good 300 yards away. When I peeked over the railing, it had already turned away, moving with surprising speed toward the denser forest beyond the clear-cut. Film. I needed film. I rushed back inside, tearing through drawers and cabinets. There had to be a roll somewhere. I'd just bought some last month at the Walgreens in town. Where had I put it? I found a box in the back of my desk drawer and fumbled to load the camera. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the film twice before managing to get it in. By the time I made it back outside, the creature was gone. I stood on my porch for another hour, scanning the tree line, but it never reappeared. Eventually, the cold drove me inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I locked the door behind me, something I rarely did during daylight hours. What if it had seen me? What if it decided to investigate? The rest of that day passed in a blur of anxiety and exhilaration. I paced from window to window, camera in hand, hoping for another glimpse. By nightfall, my nerves were shot. I double-checked every lock, pulled all the curtains, and sat in my recliner with a shotgun across my lap. I didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion eventually claimed me. I woke to the sound of something moving on my porch. The floor creaked under heavy weight. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached for the shotgun, still sitting across my lap. The digital clock on my VCR read 2:17 a.m. Another creak, closer to the window. I held my breath. Something scraped against the side of the house, like a large hand dragging across the wooden siding. I leveled the shotgun at the window, my finger trembling near the trigger. The sounds stopped. Minutes passed in silence. Finally, I heard heavy footsteps moving away, down the steps across the yard. I didn't dare look. When dawn broke, I found nothing but some displaced gravel near the porch steps. No footprints, no evidence. Just the lingering certainty that something had been there. That sighting in 1995 wasn't my first encounter. I'd seen one before, back in 1986 in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I was driving with my buddy Ray Clement on a logging road near Seney. It was late afternoon, the light already fading under the thick canopy. We came around a bend, and there it was, crossing the road about 50 yards ahead. Ray slammed on the brakes. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. It didn't run, didn't panic, just turned its head to look at us, then continued into the woods on the other side. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 seconds. We sat there in silence for a full minute before Ray turned to me and said, "That was a damn Bigfoot." I nodded, unable to form words. When we told people back in town, they laughed, called us drunk, though we hadn't had a drop, said we saw a bear standing up. After a while, we started laughing too. What else could we do? But Ray and I knew what we'd seen. After the Kelso sighting, I became obsessed. I spent every free moment researching Bigfoot sightings, focusing particularly on the Mount St. Helens area. Turned out my property on Strander Road sat right in the middle of a historical hotspot for sightings. The network of trails leading up to Mount St. Helens provided perfect corridors for these creatures to move undetected. The 1980 eruption had disrupted their patterns, some researchers believed, forcing them into new territories. I set up a trail camera at the edge of my property, checking it daily for any sign. For weeks, nothing appeared except deer, raccoons, and the occasional black bear. But on May 12th, about a month after my sighting, I found the camera dangling by its strap. The casing cracked. When I checked the film, the last image showed a blur of dark fur and what looked like fingers reaching toward the lens. That night, I heard wood knocking from the forest, 3 distinct knocks followed by silence. I'd read about this behavior in Bigfoot literature. A form of communication, they said. I stood on my porch, listening intently, but didn't dare respond. The next morning, I found 3 stones stacked on my woodpile. Not balanced as they might fall naturally, but deliberately placed one atop the other. I photographed them before disturbing the pile. No human tracks around them, just the soft impression of something large having stood at the edge of my clearing. I needed to tell someone, not the local sheriff. I'd be labeled the town crackpot. Instead, I contacted a researcher named Davis Barnett, who ran a website devoted to Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. He drove up from Portland the following weekend, bringing equipment and a measured skepticism that I appreciated. "Lot of hoaxes out there," he explained as we walked the perimeter of my property. "People wanting attention, but this area has a history. Mount St. Helens, the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, it's all prime habitat." Davis set up additional cameras and audio recording equipment. He collected hair samples from bark where something had rubbed against a tree at the edge of my property. He made casts of what might have been footprints, though they were partial and inconclusive. "Might not come back for months," he warned me. "These creatures have huge territories. 50 miles? Maybe more." But something did come back, 3 nights later. I was awakened by a crash from my shed. I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight and crept to the window. In the beam of my light, I saw the shed door hanging open. Something large moved in the shadows behind it. I called Davis immediately. "It's here," I whispered into the phone. "Don't approach it," he warned. "I'm 3 hours away. Just document what you can from a safe distance." I set up my video camera on a tripod at my bedroom window, pointing it toward the shed. The night vision function gave everything a greenish glow. For over an hour, nothing moved. Then a massive shape emerged from behind the shed. The video quality was poor, but there was no mistaking the height and build. It moved with that same fluid gait I'd observed before, stopping occasionally to look around. At one point, it seemed to stare directly at my window. I ducked down, my heart pounding. When I looked back, it was moving away, toward the tree line. I kept filming until it disappeared into the darkness. When Davis arrived the next morning, we found my shed ransacked, tools scattered, feed bags torn open. In the soft earth behind the shed, a clear footprint nearly 20 inches long. Davis made a cast, his hands trembling with excitement. "This is it," he kept saying, "that this is the real deal." The casting revealed a foot with 5 distinct toes, a pronounced arch, and dermal ridges like massive fingerprints. Davis estimated the creature would stand around 9 feet tall, based on the foot size. He took the cast with him for analysis, promising to keep my name and location confidential in any publications. Word got out anyway. By June, I'd received calls from 3 different documentary filmmakers and a tabloid reporter. I refused them all. This wasn't about publicity or money. This was about understanding what was sharing these woods with me. The summer passed without further incidents. The cameras captured nothing unusual, and the wood knocking stopped. Davis suggested they might have moved higher up the mountain for the summer months, following food sources or cooler temperatures. I continued my research, connecting with other witnesses online. Many had similar stories, brief sightings, inconclusive evidence, and the inevitable ridicule that followed. Some had given up trying to convince others. They'd seen what they'd seen, and that was enough. In September, the activity resumed. First came the smell, a powerful musky odor that permeated the area around my cabin for 3 days, like wet dog mixed with skunk and something else I couldn't identify. Then the wood knocking returned, now closer to the house. One evening, I found deer parts arranged in my backyard, not scattered as if dragged by scavengers, but placed deliberately. A leg here, organs there, the head positioned facing my back door. Davis suggested it might be an offering or territorial marking. I removed the remains, but they reappeared the following night. October brought the clearest evidence yet. I woke to find my bird feeder torn from its post. 20 feet up, hanging from a branch, the metal container had been crushed like an aluminum can. No bear could have reached that height or shown such dexterity. On my porch sat a pile of blackberries, dozens of them carefully stacked in a pyramid. "It's trying to communicate," Davis said when I called him. "This is incredibly rare behavior." He installed more sophisticated equipment, motion sensors, infrared cameras, audio recorders with greater range. We set up feeding stations at increasing distances from my cabin, hoping to establish a pattern of trust. For weeks, nothing happened. Then, on November 12th, at 3:42 a.m., every device triggered simultaneously. The audio picked up bipedal movement and deep, resonant breathing. The infrared camera caught a heat signature moving between trees. Massive, upright, approximately 9 feet tall. But the regular cameras showed nothing but empty woods. "They can sense the infrared," Davis explained. "They know we're watching. They're smarter than we give them credit for." The activity intensified as winter approached, wood knocking nightly, strange arrangements of stones and sticks appearing around my property, footprints in the first light dusting of snow, always seeming to circle my cabin before heading back toward Mount St. Helens. By December, I was barely sleeping. Every night brought new sounds, new signs. The creatures never showed themselves fully again, but their presence was undeniable. They were studying me as intently as I was studying them. On December 21st, the winter solstice, I woke to find a large branch propped against my front door. Hanging from it were dozens of small objects, feathers, animal teeth, bits of colored glass I'd used to decorate my garden. Items from my property, arranged in what could only be deliberate patterns. Davis was ecstatic when I sent him photos. "This is unprecedented," he said. "They're leaving you gifts." That night I left my own offering, a basket of fruit and a flashlight, on my porch. By morning, the fruit was gone. The flashlight remained untouched. As winter deepened, the visits grew less frequent. By January, the woods had fallen silent again. Davis suggested they'd move to lower elevations for the winter, away from the heaviest snow. He promised to return in spring, when they might migrate back through the area. I've tried telling people about my experiences over the years. Most laugh. Some humor me with feigned interest. A few get angry, as if my story somehow threatens their understanding of the world. I've learned to laugh along with them, to shrug it off, but I know what I saw that April morning in 1995. I know what continued to visit my property in the months that followed. No bear, no man in a suit. Something else entirely, something that has as much right to these woods as I do. I still live on Strander Road, still watch the tree line every morning with my coffee. I've seen them 3 more times in the years since, always at a distance, always briefly. Each sighting reinforces what I already know. We are not alone in these woods. We never have been. Story 12. My hands shook as I loaded the small shovel into my backpack. Dawn was just breaking over Bell County, and I had a good feeling about today's hunt. Ginseng prices were up, and I knew a patch on Pine Mountain that few others had discovered. My wife Brenda was still asleep when I scribbled a note. Gone digging. Back by supper. September 12th, 2002, a date that would burn itself into my memory forever. The drive to my spot took 30 minutes, my old Ford pickup rattling over the uneven back roads. I parked at the base of a logging path and checked my gear one last time. Shovel, canvas collection bag, water bottle, pocket knife, and a ham sandwich for lunch. The temperature was perfect, about 65 degrees with clear skies. A good day to be in the woods. I started up the path that wound along a ridge overlooking the Cumberland River. The morning sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with patches of light. Birds called overhead. The familiar sense of soil and vegetation filled my lungs as I hiked deeper into the wilderness. By 8 a.m., I'd reached my hunting grounds, a north-facing slope with mature hardwoods and rich, loamy soil, perfect conditions for wild ginseng. I veered off the main trail and began scanning the ground for the distinctive cluster of 5 leaves that marked a mature plant. The first hour went well. I found 3 decent roots, nothing spectacular but enough to make the trip worthwhile. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush or the distant call of a crow. Then something changed. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what was different. The birds had gone quiet, but that happens sometimes. I stopped to take a drink of water and felt a prickle at the back of my neck, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing moved. The forest held its breath. "Hello," I called out, thinking maybe another hunter had wandered into the area. My voice sounded small in the vast stillness. No response. I shrugged it off and continued hunting, working my way along the slope. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger even, and then I noticed the smell. It hit me in waves as I moved, a powerful rank odor like a wet deer carcass mixed with dog fur. I'd been hunting these woods for 20 years and never smelled anything like it. The stench would come strong, then fade away, as if whatever caused it was moving parallel to me through the forest. By 10 a.m., my nerves were on edge. Twice I'd heard what sounded like footsteps, heavy ones, moving through the brush about 50 yards behind me. Each time I turned to look, the sound stopped immediately. Just a bear, I told myself, though bears don't typically stalk people, and bears make more noise moving through underbrush. I pressed on, moving higher up the slope. The ginseng hunting was good, and I wasn't going to let some animal spook me out of a profitable day. Still, I found myself stopping more frequently, listening to the forest, turning to check my back trail. Around noon, I sat on a fallen log to eat my sandwich. The feeling of being watched intensified. The hair on my arms stood up despite the warm day. I ate quickly, scanning the trees around me. The smell had grown stronger, a musky animal odor that seemed to hang in the still air. I packed up and continued hunting, but my focus was split between scanning for ginseng plants and checking my surroundings. The forest had remained unnaturally quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the occasional snap of a twig from somewhere behind me. At 1:30 p.m. I hit the jackpot. Nestled between two moss-covered rocks was a mature ginseng plant with a cluster of bright red berries at its top. I knelt down and carefully began to dig around its base, taking care not to damage the root. As the soil fell away, I could see I'd found something special. A four-pronged root, thick and gnarled with age, worth at least $100. I was so focused on the root that I didn't immediately notice the change. Then it registered. The silence had deepened. Even the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to have stopped. The smell hit me again, stronger than before, making my nose wrinkle. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of movement in the brush about 20 yards behind me. Not the cautious steps from before, but deliberate movement. Branches breaking, undergrowth being pushed aside. I froze, the ginseng root half excavated in front of me. Sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the cool mountain air. The brush directly behind me began to shake violently. A sound erupted from the vegetation, a deep, guttural grunt that rose into a growl unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a cougar, nothing that should exist in the Kentucky mountains. I abandoned the shovel and root and ran. Blind panic drove me downhill, away from whatever was behind me. I crashed through underbrush, slipping on damp leaves, catching myself against tree trunks. The thing behind me was moving too. I could hear it charging through the forest, snapping branches that would have slowed a man or even a bear. My foot caught on a root, and I sprawled forward, scrambling back to my feet in an instant. The sounds behind me grew closer. I changed direction, plunging into a dense stand of young trees, saplings about 3 inches thick, growing close together. I squeezed between them, hoping to slow whatever pursued me. It didn't work. I heard the crack and snap of the saplings behind me, not being pushed aside, but being broken through. The realization hit me like a physical blow. What was chasing me was big enough and strong enough to plow straight through trees that would stop a man or even a bear. My lungs burned. Sweat stung my eyes. I knew I couldn't outrun it much longer. Up ahead, the ground dropped away sharply, a 12-foot embankment down to an old logging road. With the creature closing in, I had no choice. I jumped. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs. I tumbled and slid the rest of the way down, coming to rest in the roadside ditch. Pain shot through my ankle. For a moment I lay there gasping, certain that whatever had chased me would be on me in seconds. When nothing happened, I forced myself to look back up the slope. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. Standing at the edge of the drop-off was a figure, not a bear, not any animal I recognized. It stood upright on 2 legs, its massive shoulders and head visible above the vegetation. The creature's head was humanoid in shape, but proportionally small for its enormous body. Its fur was a brownish-red color, matted in places. From my position and the distance between us, I estimated it stood at least 8 feet tall. For 3 heartbeats we stared at each other. Its eyes reflected an intelligence that terrified me more than its size. Then it took a single step backward and disappeared into the forest. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I limped down the logging road as fast as my injured ankle would allow, constantly checking over my shoulder. The smell lingered in my nostrils, even though the creature was gone. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach my truck. Each snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. By the time I pulled myself into the driver's seat, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool day. I cranked the engine and peeled out, gravel spitting from under my tires. Brenda knew something was wrong the moment I walked through the door. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, or something worse. "Terry, what happened?" she asked, helping me to the couch. "You're white as a sheet." I told her everything, the stalking presence, the smell, the chase, what I'd seen on the hillside. As I spoke, I realized how crazy it all sounded. A Bigfoot in Bell County. People would think I'd lost my mind. "You believe me, don't you?" I asked when I finished. Brenda sat beside me, her hand on mine. "I've known you 23 years, Terry. You don't make up stories, and you don't spook easy. If you say that's what happened, then that's what happened." That night, I didn't sleep. Every noise outside our window jerked me awake. I kept seeing those eyes, that massive shape at the edge of the embankment. I kept smelling that distinctive odor. The next morning, my ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. Brenda insisted I go to the clinic in Pineville. The doctor diagnosed a moderate sprain, prescribed rest and ice, and asked how I'd injured it. "Fell on a hunting trip," I said. I wasn't about to tell him the truth. For weeks afterward, I jumped at shadows. Loud noises made my heart race. I refused to go back into the woods, even when Bobby Jenkins asked me to join his deer hunting group in October. The thought of being on Pine Mountain after dark was more than I could handle. Folks noticed the change in me. At the hardware store, old Jim Reeves asked why I was looking so worn out. At church, Pastor Miller pulled me aside to ask if everything was all right at home. I made up excuses. Trouble sleeping, worried about money, anything but the truth. I did research, reading everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings in the Appalachians. There were more reports than I expected, dating back decades. Some from hunters and hikers with solid reputations. Many described the same details I'd experienced. The smell, the feeling of being watched, the incredible strength. The Pine Mountain area had everything a creature like that would need. Water from the Cumberland River, remote forest for cover, game for food, and minimal human presence in the deeper areas. By the following summer, I'd regained enough courage to return to the woods, but never alone, and never to that specific area of Pine Mountain. I found new spots for ginseng hunting, always keeping to more open terrain where I could see what was around me. I carried a larger caliber handgun than before. I told people it was for snakes and the occasional aggressive black bear, but I knew what it was really for. Sometimes at night, I still dream about those 3 heartbeats when we locked eyes. Me and something that shouldn't exist in the Kentucky mountains. I wake up with the sheets soaked in sweat, that animal smell seeming to fill our bedroom. Brenda holds me until the shaking stops. I've never told anyone else the full story. What would be the point? Half would think I was crazy, the other half would want to go hunting for it themselves, but that section of Pine Mountain belongs to something else now. Something that's probably been there all along, watching hunters and hikers from the shadows, usually choosing to remain hidden. I was one of the unlucky ones. I got too close. These days, when I'm in the woods and the birds go suddenly quiet, I don't stick around to find out why. When the hair rises on the back of my neck, I trust that feeling. I've learned that sometimes the monsters from campfire stories are real. They have teeth and claws and strength beyond anything human. They have eyes that watch from the deep woods, and sometimes, if you're very unlucky, they chase you down a Kentucky mountainside, changing forever what you believe about the wilderness around you. Story 13. My hands were steady, as I swept the metal detector over the ground, but my heart danced at each beep. That's how it had been since Thomas bought us these detectors for our 40th anniversary. 5 years into retirement, and we'd finally found a hobby that got us both excited to climb out of the RV each morning. "Rebecca, come see this!" Thomas called from a few feet away, his voice cracking with excitement. I shuffled over, my boots crunching against the dry pine needles covering the old stagecoach trail. The late October sun filtered through the trees of the Marble Mountain wilderness, casting long shadows across the forest floor. This part of Northern California was beautiful in the fall, cool enough to keep the bugs away, but not so cold that my arthritis acted up. Thomas held up something small and golden, brushing dirt from its surface with his thumb. "Is that what I think it is?" I asked, leaning in closer. "Pocket watch, and a nice one." He turned it over in his weathered hands, fingernails still stained with engine grease, despite being retired from his mechanic job for years. "Look at this inscription." I pulled my reading glasses from where they hung around my neck and squinted at the tiny engraving. "To my beloved Jonathan, may time bring you always back to me. Sarah, 1811. "Almost 200 years old," I whispered, running my finger across the smooth gold surface. "You think it fell from a stagecoach?" Thomas nodded, his eyes bright behind his thick glasses. "Probably. Some poor fella probably had a fit when he realized he'd lost it." We spent the next few hours searching the area, hoping to find more treasures from the past. The metal detectors hummed and beeped occasionally, but nothing compared to the pocket watch. Still, we didn't mind. The thrill was in the hunt. By late afternoon, the temperature had begun to drop. The shadows lengthened across the forest floor, and I zipped up my fleece jacket against the chill. "We should head back," I called to Thomas, who had wandered about 20 feet away. "It'll be dark soon." "Just a few more minutes," he replied, not looking up. "I'm getting some good signals here." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. My husband of 45 years was nothing if not persistent. While I waited, I scanned the trees surrounding us. We'd seen a few deer earlier, and I hoped to catch another glimpse before we left. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. About 40 feet away, partially hidden by the shadows between two large pine trees, stood a figure. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It was standing upright, swaying slightly from side to side. "Thomas!" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. When he didn't respond, I tried again, louder. "Thomas!" He looked up, frowning. "What's wrong?" I pointed toward the trees, my hand trembling. "Look!" Thomas turned, the metal detectors forgotten in his hands. The figure remained perfectly still, except for that strange, swaying motion. It was tall, at least 6 feet, maybe more, and covered in dark hair. Not fur exactly, but hair. Long black hair that hung down past its shoulders. "Bigfoot," I blurted out, the word escaping before I could stop it. The creature's head tilted, and then it made a sound that sent ice down my spine. "Hoo, hoo, hoo," it vocalized, the sound somewhere between a question and a call. Thomas moved toward me, stepping between me and the creature. "Stay behind me, Becky," he muttered, using the nickname he reserved for tense moments. Now that Thomas stood beside me, I could see the creature more clearly. Its face wasn't completely hidden by hair as I'd first thought. Instead, I could make out features, eyes that looked startlingly human, wide with what seemed like fear or apprehension. Its face was broad, unshaven, with a curly beard that contrasted with the straight hair on its head. One side of its hair was tucked behind what appeared to be an ear. The creature's body was massive, broader than any man I'd ever seen, with long arms that hung at its sides. Despite its wild appearance, there was something almost groomed about it. The hair wasn't matted or tangled as you might expect from a wild animal. "What is it doing?" I whispered to Thomas, gripping his arm. "I don't know," he replied. his voice low and steady despite the slight tremble I felt in his body, but it seemed scared of us. The creature's eyes darted between us, then fixed on the metal detectors in Thomas's hands. Its swaying intensified, and it took a half-step backward. "I think it thinks these are weapons," Thomas said, slowly lowering the metal detectors to the ground. We stood frozen in a bizarre standoff. The forest had gone quiet, no birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just us and this, whatever it was. Then, without warning, the creature took one enormous step backward, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. There was a rush of movement, the sound of branches snapping, and it was gone. The speed with which it moved was astonishing. One moment there, the next vanished. "Oh my God!" I gasped, suddenly aware that I'd been holding my breath. "Thomas, what was that?" My husband's face was pale, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I don't know, Becky. I honestly don't know." We gathered our equipment with shaking hands and hurried back toward our RV. Neither of us spoke much on the walk back, both processing what we'd seen. The forest suddenly seemed different, watching us, alive with secrets. Back at the RV, I immediately grabbed my journal while Thomas poured us each a stiff drink. My handwriting was barely legible as I documented every detail I could remember. The height, the hair, the eyes, that strange hoo-hoo-hoo sound. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Thomas asked, sitting heavily in his recliner. I looked up from my journal. "Does it matter? We know what we saw." We stayed at the campground for 2 more days, but didn't return to that specific trail. Instead, we drove into the nearest town and visited the local library, where the librarian, a young woman named Judy with kind eyes and a patient smile, showed us newspaper clippings and books about Bigfoot sightings in the Siskiyou River forest area stretching back decades. "Folks around here take these stories pretty seriously," Judy told us, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "My own grandfather claimed to have seen one back in 72. A week later, we packed up the RV and headed south. By mutual agreement, we never returned to the Marble Mountain Wilderness. 6 months after that, we sold our property in California altogether and moved our metal detecting hobby to the sandy shores of Florida, where the only creatures we encountered were the occasional alligator or curious seagull. But I never forgot what we saw that day in the forest. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I still hear that eerie call, hoo, 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 and wonder what exactly was watching us from the trees. Thomas and I rarely spoke about the incident again, but we didn't need to. The memory was etched into both of us, a shared secret, a moment when the world as we understood it shifted slightly on its axis. Years passed. Our metal detecting adventures continued, yielding Spanish coins on Florida beaches, lost wedding rings, and countless bottle caps. But nothing ever compared to that day in Northern California, not just because of the gold pocket watch, but because of what happened afterward. Then, last spring, I saw something in the newspaper that made my coffee mug slip from my fingers and shatter on the kitchen floor. "Thomas!" I called, my voice shaking. "Thomas, come here!" He shuffled in from the living room, the TV still blaring in the background. "What's wrong?" I pointed to the article, a small piece tucked away on page 3. "Hiker reports unusual encounter in Marble Mountain Wilderness." Thomas adjusted his glasses and leaned over my shoulder to read. According to the article, a solo hiker had reported seeing a large, hair-covered bipedal creature near the old Stagecoach Trail. The hiker had managed to take a blurry photograph that showed what might have been a tall figure standing between trees. What caught my attention, though, was the hiker's description of the sound the creature made, a distinct hoo-hoo-hoo that had echoed through the forest before it disappeared. "It's the same one," I whispered, looking up at Thomas. "It has to be." Thomas said nothing, but his hand found mine on the table, squeezing it tightly. That night, I pulled out my old journal and reread my account from 2006. Every detail was there, just as I remembered it. The frightened, human-like eyes, the long black hair with one side tucked behind its ear, the curly beard, that strange questioning call. I closed the journal and walked to the window, staring out at the Florida night. So different from the dense forests of Northern California, so far away from that moment when something impossible stepped out of the trees and into our lives. "Do you ever regret not going back?" Thomas asked from his chair, seeming to read my thoughts. I considered the question. "No," I said finally. "Some things aren't meant to be pursued. Some mysteries should stay mysteries." Thomas nodded, understanding. We never returned to Marble Mountain. We never sought publicity for our experience or tried to prove what we'd seen, but we knew. In that moment, on the old stagecoach trail, something had acknowledged us, had seen us seeing it, and sometimes that's enough. The gold pocket watch sits in a display case in our living room, a conversation piece for guests who don't know the full story of our treasure hunting days. "To my beloved Jonathan, may time bring you always back to me." Sarah, 1811. Time brings us all back to something, eventually. For Thomas and me, our thoughts often return to that October afternoon when the veil between the known and unknown world briefly parted, and we glimpsed something on the other side, something that looked back. Story 14. I'd never heard a sound like that before, and I pray to God I never hear it again. My name's Mark Kennedy. Back in 2006, I was 24 years old and working a seasonal job with the Forest Service in Northern California. The pay wasn't great, but the work suited me. I'd always been comfortable outdoors, and I preferred physical labor to sitting behind a desk. Plus, the views beat any office window. In early June that year, I joined a trail maintenance crew assigned to the Trinity Alps wilderness. 12 of us altogether, 8 men and 4 women, mostly in our 20s, with a couple of older guys in their 30s. Our supervisor, Dale Jenkins, had been clearing trails for 15 years and knew the Trinity Alps better than anyone. The rest of us were a mix of experience levels. Some, like me, had a season or two under our belts. Others were fresh recruits. Our assignment was to clear fallen trees and debris from hiking paths deep in the wilderness, repair damaged trail sections, and improve signage for backpackers. Basic maintenance work that required basic tools, chainsaws, axes, shovels, and plenty of muscle. We'd be camping out for 10 days, working our way through a section of the wilderness that had been neglected for a few seasons. On our first day, we loaded our gear into 2 Forest Service trucks and drove to the trailhead. From there, we hiked 5 miles to our base camp at Red Cap Lake. The hike in was strenuous with all our equipment, but the scenery made it worthwhile. The Trinity Alps aren't as famous as some other mountain ranges, but they're just as beautiful. Jagged peaks, alpine meadows dotted with wildflowers, crystal clear streams. We reached Red Cap Lake by mid-afternoon. The campsite sat in a natural meadow beside the small lake, surrounded on 3 sides by dense forest. The 4th side featured imposing rock cliffs that shot up 200 to 300 feet above us. The setting sun cast a golden glow on those cliff faces while we set up camp, pitching tents, establishing a fire pit, hanging our food supplies from trees to keep them away from bears. "Beautiful spot," Dale said as we finished setting up. "But remember, we're here to work, not vacation. Up at 6 tomorrow. We've got about 3 miles of trail to clear." That first night passed uneventfully. We sat around the campfire, ate freeze-dried meals, and got to know each other better. Some of the crew I'd worked with before, like Becky Wright and Jason Howland, but others were new faces. We swapped stories and jokes until the fire died down, then turned in early, knowing we faced a hard day's work when the sun rose. Our first full day of trail work went smoothly. We hiked about a mile from camp to the section that needed clearing, then spent hours removing fallen branches, cutting through trees that had toppled across the path, and repairing eroded sections. The work was physical and exhausting, but satisfying. By late afternoon, we'd cleared nearly 2 miles of trail. Along the way, I noticed several unusual rock formations, stacks of stones that didn't look natural. When I mentioned them to Dale, he shrugged. Probably just trail markers or something, or maybe hikers stacking rocks for fun. Nothing to worry about. We returned to camp, tired and hungry. After washing up in the cold lake water, we prepared dinner and gathered around the fire as darkness settled over the meadow. The stars emerged overhead, thousands of them, more than you ever see in the city. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared, and we huddled closer to the flames. It was around 9:30 p.m. We'd been sharing ghost stories, the kind you always tell around campfires. Jason had just finished a particularly silly one about a hook-handed killer, and we were all laughing. That's when we heard it, the scream. I've tried many times to describe that sound, but words don't do it justice. It started as a low moan that quickly rose in pitch and volume until it became a shriek that seemed to fill the entire meadow. It wasn't human, I'm certain of that. No person could make a sound so powerful, so primal. But it wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard either. Not a mountain lion, not a wolf, not a bear. The scream lasted maybe 15 seconds, though it felt much longer. The weird thing was, I couldn't pinpoint where it came from. It seemed to surround us, coming from all directions at once, like the entire forest was screaming. We all froze, the fire crackled, nobody spoke, nobody moved. I remember looking at the faces around me, illuminated by the firelight. Every single person wore the same expression. Wide eyes, pale skin, open mouths, pure terror. When the scream finally stopped, the silence felt thick and heavy. Then Becky whispered, "What the hell was that?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. Then we heard something else. A new sound coming from the cliffs above our camp. A cracking noise, like wood splintering. Then a tremendous crash followed by the sound of something massive tumbling down the rocky cliff face. "Something's coming down!" Dale shouted, jumping to his feet. I stood up too, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. I stared up at the darkness of the cliff, trying to see what was falling, but it was too dark. All I could do was listen to the terrifying progression of sounds. The initial crack, then the scraping and banging, as whatever it was bounced off the rocks, picking up speed as it descended toward our camp. The sounds grew louder, closer. I remember thinking, this is it. I'm going to die. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. My vision tunneled, and everything around the edges turned the brightest shade of yellow I ever seen. I'd learn later that's what extreme fear does to your perception. Distorts colors, narrows vision. I was sure a boulder was about to crush us. Or maybe something worse, something that had made that ungodly scream. The crashing noise reached the bottom of the cliff, and then nothing. Whatever had fallen had stopped short of our camp. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. "Everyone okay?" Dale called out, his voice shaky. We all mumbled that we were fine, though fine wasn't the right word. We were alive, but we were far from fine. "What was that?" Jason asked. "A rock slide?" "Didn't sound like rocks," Dale said. "Sounded like a tree." "But trees don't fall by themselves," Becky said. "Not without a storm or something cutting them down." Dale shrugged, but I could see he was rattled. Let's add more wood to the fire. We'll figure it out in the morning." None of us slept much that night. We kept the fire blazing until dawn, taking shifts to stay awake and keep watch. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf in the forest around us set my heart racing. That scream kept replaying in my head. I'd never heard anything so terrifying in my life. When the first light of dawn finally appeared, it felt like we'd survived something. Though none of us knew exactly what, after a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, Dale led us to investigate what had fallen down the cliff. We didn't have to search long. About 50 yards from our camp at the base of the cliff lay a full-grown fir tree. It was approximately 50 feet tall, or had been, before it was ripped from the ground. The root ball was intact, covered with soil and smaller rocks. The tree hadn't been cut or broken. It had been pulled up, roots and all. "Jesus," whispered Jason, "look at the size of this thing." We all stared at the tree in silence. It would have taken tremendous force to uproot it, and the cliff, where it had come from, was steep, not the kind of place you'd expect to find a large tree growing in the first place. "Could a bear have done this?" asked Lisa Chen, one of the newer crew members. Dale shook his head. "No way! Not even a grizzly could pull up a tree this size. And there aren't any grizzlies in California anyway." "Maybe it was already loose," suggested Mike Talbot, another crew member. "Wind could have weakened it over time." "There wasn't any wind last night," I said. "Not even a breeze." We looked up the cliff face, trying to spot where the tree had come from. About halfway up, we could see a fresh scar in the vegetation, the path the tree had taken on its way down. "I don't like this," Becky said. "First that scream, now this." Dale straightened up, clearly trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Look, I'm sure there's a rational explanation. Maybe some kind of earth movement we didn't feel, or maybe animals weakened the roots. Whatever it was, it's over now. We've got work to do today." Nobody mentioned what we were all thinking, that the scream and the falling tree might be connected. We spent that day working on the trail as planned, but the mood was different. Everyone stayed closer together. Conversations were hushed. We kept looking over our shoulders. Dale pushed us to finish early, and we were back at camp before sunset, unusual for a trail crew. That evening, as we sat uneasily around the campfire, we heard the sound of someone approaching through the woods. We all tensed up, reaching for whatever tools were nearby. I gripped the handle of my axe so tight my knuckles turned white. A figure emerged from the trees, a man in his 50s with copper-colored skin and long black hair tied back in a ponytail. He wore Forest Service pants and a flannel shirt. I recognized him immediately as Joseph Tallfeather, a Native American guide who occasionally worked with the Forest Service. I'd met him briefly during training. "Evening, folks," Joseph said calmly. "Dale radioed for some assistance?" Dale stood up, clearly relieved. "Joseph, thanks for coming. Didn't expect you until tomorrow." "I was already at Pine Ridge Station when your call came in," Joseph said. "Thought I'd hike in tonight rather than wait." Dale introduced Joseph to the crew members who didn't know him, then quickly explained what had happened the previous night. The scream, the falling tree. Joseph listened without interrupting. When Dale finished, the guide nodded slowly. "Can you show me where the tree fell?" We led him to the uprooted fir. In the fading daylight, Joseph examined it carefully, running his hands over the trunk and inspecting the root ball. Then he looked up at the cliff. "And those rock stacks you mentioned seeing on the trail," he said. "Where were they exactly?" I described their location as best I could. Joseph nodded again. "Prayer rocks," he said. "You were working near prayer rocks." "What are those?" Lisa asked. "Markers, sacred places." Joseph turned to Dale. "You should have checked with the tribal liaison before sending a crew here." Dale looked uncomfortable. "We checked the maps. There's no registered cultural sites in this section." "Not everything is on your maps," Joseph replied. His voice wasn't angry, just matter of fact. "What does this have to do with what happened last night?" I asked. Joseph looked at me for a long moment before answering. "This area is special to my people. Has been for centuries. The prayer rocks mark boundaries of sacred ground. Ground that's protected." "Protected by what?" Becky asked. "By who, not what," Joseph corrected gently. "My people call it Saskets. Other tribes have different names. White folks call it Bigfoot." There was a moment of silence, then a few nervous laughs from the crew. "Bigfoot," Jason said. "You're saying Bigfoot screamed at us and threw a tree down a cliff?" Joseph didn't smile. "I'm saying you were warned. You entered protected ground and the Guardian let you know." "With all due respect," Dale said, "we can't just avoid trail maintenance because of local legends." Joseph's expression didn't change. "Not asking you to, just saying you should respect boundaries. Those prayer rocks, work around them, not through them. Leave them as you found them." "And the scream?" I asked. "What was that?" "Sasket speaks rarely," Joseph said. "When it does, people remember." That night, Joseph stayed at our camp. His presence somehow made us all feel safer, though none of us fully believed his explanation. Bigfoot wasn't real. It couldn't be real. There had to be some other explanation for what we'd experienced. The next morning, Joseph helped us identify the boundaries of what he called sacred ground. We adjusted our trail work to respect these areas, working around rather than through them. Whether we believed in Bigfoot or not, it seemed prudent to follow Joseph's advice. We spent 8 more days in the Trinity Alps, completing our assigned trail maintenance. We never heard the scream again. No more trees fell. But something had changed in all of us. The forest felt different now, less familiar, more mysterious. When we finally hiked out and returned to civilization, we mostly stopped talking about what had happened that night. It was easier to focus on the work we'd accomplished, the trails we'd cleared, the normal, explainable parts of our experience. Years passed. I continued working seasonal jobs with the Forest Service, eventually becoming a full-time ranger. I never returned to Red Cap Lake, though opportunities arose. Something kept me away. In 2015, nearly a decade after that night in the Trinity Alps, I was scrolling through channels on my TV when I stopped on a documentary about Bigfoot sightings. I nearly changed the channel. I'd never put much stock in cryptid stories, but then they played an audio recording. It was a scream, not exactly like the one we'd heard that night, but close enough to make my blood run cold. I sat frozen on my couch, the remote control slipping from my fingers as memories flooded back. The documentary went on to explain that such vocalizations were commonly reported in Bigfoot encounters, that the creatures were known to throw rocks, push over trees, and make territorial displays when humans encroached on their areas. I've never told many people about what happened at Red Cap Lake. When I do, I usually leave out the part about Bigfoot. I say we heard a strange animal sound, that a dead tree fell because of erosion. It's easier that way. People don't look at you funny. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the forest and darkness falls, I remember that scream, that bone-chilling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I remember the utter terror I felt when I heard that massive tree crashing down toward our camp. I remember the brightest yellow I ever seen as fear took over my senses. And I wonder about Joseph's words, about sacred ground and ancient guardians, about boundaries that should be respected. Most of all, I wonder what would have happened if that tree had fallen just 50 yards closer to our camp. I still work in forests, still love the outdoors, but I never go anywhere without checking local knowledge first. And when I see stacked rocks on a trail, I give them a wide berth. Some might call it superstition. I call it survival. Whatever screamed at us that night in the Trinity Alps wilderness, whatever ripped a 50-foot tree from the ground and sent it crashing down toward us, it was warning us, and I, for one, decided to listen. Down to story 15. I still remember that morning in 1963 like it happened yesterday. The cold air biting at my face, the smell of pine, and that moment when my entire understanding of the world changed forever. My name's Samuel Thornton. I was 32 years old back then, living in Pinecrest, just a small dot on the map in rural California. Every November, our family would get together for our annual deer hunting trip in the Sierra National Forest. It was tradition. Me, my brother Elmer, our cousins Jim and Ray, and my uncle Walt, who'd been hunting these woods since before I was born. We'd left town just after dinner the previous day, piled into Walt's station wagon with our gear strapped to the roof. The drive took close to 4 hours, winding through dark mountain roads. The headlights cut through the pitch-black night, occasionally catching the gleaming eyes of some critter watching from the roadside. "Weather's perfect this year," Uncle Walt had said, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. "Cold front moved in yesterday. Deer'll be moving to lower elevations." We arrived at our usual campsite around midnight. Too tired to set up proper camp, we just rolled out our sleeping bags in the back of the wagon and beside the fire pit. I remember looking up at the stars through the trees before falling asleep, clearer than you'd ever see them in town. The alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. It was still dark, cold enough to see our breath hanging in the air. We ate a quick breakfast of coffee and jerky, checked our rifles, and studied our maps by flashlight. "Same zones as last year," Walt said, marking areas on the map with his stubby finger. "Samuel, you take that ridgeline west of Copper Creek. Lots of buck sign there last season." We separated before dawn, each heading to our assigned locations. I hiked about 2 miles to my spot, using my flashlight sparingly to avoid spooking any game. The forest was silent except for my boots crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. By the time I reached my position, the sky was just beginning to lighten. I found a good vantage point behind some fallen timber with clear sightlines across a small clearing and down into a ravine. Perfect ambush spot for any deer moving through. I settled in, leaning against a large pine, rifle across my lap. The first hour passed uneventfully as the forest woke up around me. Squirrels chattered, birds called, and the sun slowly climbed. Around 8:30, I spotted my first deer, a young doe picking her way through the brush about 80 yards out. I watched her through my scope, but didn't shoot. We were after bucks, and Uncle Walt had strict rules about taking does, unless you had a specific tag. At 10:15, a small 3-point buck appeared at the edge of the clearing, but he was too far for a clean shot. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, hoping he'd move closer. After what seemed like an eternity, he turned and disappeared back into the trees. The hours dragged on. I ate the sandwich I'd packed, took small sips from my canteen. By early afternoon, I'd seen 2 more does and another small buck, but nothing worth taking a shot at. The warm afternoon sun hit my face, and after sitting motionless for so long, fatigue began setting in. I decided to take a short nap. It was around 2:30 p.m., the slowest time for deer movement anyway. I propped my rifle securely beside me, adjusted my position against the log, and pulled my hat down over my eyes. I figured 20 minutes of shut-eye wouldn't hurt, and I'd still have plenty of daylight left for the evening hunt, when deer would be more active. I don't know exactly how long I slept. Might have been 15 minutes, might have been 45. What I do know is that something woke me, not a sound, but a feeling. The distinct primal sensation of being watched. You spend enough time in the woods, you develop a 6th sense for when eyes are on you. Every hunter knows it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something was there, something close. I didn't move immediately. Keeping my eyes barely open beneath the brim of my hat, I scanned what I could see without moving my head. Nothing. But that feeling persisted, stronger than I'd ever felt it before. Slowly, I reached for my rifle. The cold metal felt reassuring in my grip. I took a deep breath and sat up carefully, expecting to see a curious deer or maybe even a coyote checking me out. What I saw instead froze the blood in my veins. No more than 10 feet away, a massive figure was moving away from me at an angle. My first thought was that another hunter had stumbled upon me while I slept and was now leaving. But something wasn't right. "Hey there!" I called out, not too loud. The figure made no response, no acknowledgement, no startled jump or turn of the head. It just continued moving away with deliberate steps. That's when I realized what I was seeing. This was no hunter. The creature, and I choose that word carefully, was covered in thick, grayish-black hair, not like a bear's fur, different somehow, coarser, longer in patches. It walked upright on two legs with a smooth, rolling gait that seemed impossibly fluid for something so large. I caught a glimpse of its head as it turned slightly, not rounded like a human's, but with a pointed quality to the rear, almost conical. There was no distinction between the hair on its head and body. It all seemed to be one continuous covering. What little skin I could see around what must have been its face was the same dark color as the hair. The size of it is what struck me most. I'm 6 feet even, and this thing towered over what I'd consider normal. At least 6'6", maybe more, and the width of its shoulders, Lord, it was like looking at a linebacker, but half again as broad. Massive, powerful arms swung at its sides. But what truly unsettled me was the silence. The forest floor where we were was covered with dry branches, pine needles, and fallen debris. When I'd walked to my spot that morning, every step had crackled and snapped, no matter how careful I tried to be. This creature moved across that same ground without making a sound, not a single twig snap, no rustle of leaves, nothing. I sat there, rifle half-heartedly pointed in its direction, frozen in disbelief. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the thicker forest beyond the clearing, gone, as if it had never been there at all. For several minutes I didn't move, couldn't move. My heart hammered in my chest so loud I was sure anything within 50 yards could hear it. My mouth had gone bone dry. Finally I stood up, rifle at the ready. I scanned the forest edge where the creature had disappeared. Nothing moved except the branches, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. I debated with myself about what to do next. Part of me wanted to track it, to confirm what I'd seen. The more sensible part of me knew that following an unknown creature of that size into dense forest was a fool's errand that could get me killed. I checked my watch. 3:20 p.m. We were all supposed to meet back at camp by sunset, around 5:02. I decided to stay put for another hour, but I couldn't focus on hunting anymore. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had me jerking my head in that direction, rifle raised. No deer came. Nothing came. The forest had returned to its normal afternoon quiet. At 4:30, I packed up and began the hike back to camp, constantly checking over my shoulder. I moved faster than was wise, making more noise than any decent hunter should. I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to the others. I was the second one back. Jim was already there, cleaning a small 4-pointer he'd taken. "Any luck?" he asked without looking up from his work. "No," I said, setting my rifle down. My hands were still shaking. But I saw something. Jim glanced up, probably hearing something in my voice. "Buck fever got you missing shots again." "Wasn't a deer," I said. I sat down hard on a log by the unlit campfire. "What then? Bear?" I shook my head. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. It sounded crazy even in my own head. One by one, the others returned. Ray empty-handed, Elmer with a decent 5-point, and finally Uncle Walt with nothing but a scowl. After we'd eaten and the fire was going strong, Walt passed around his flask of whiskey. The amber liquid burned going down, but it steadied my nerves enough to speak. "I saw something today," I began. "Something I can't explain." They all looked at me, firelight flickering across their faces. "What, like a mountain lion?" Elmer asked. "No." I took another sip of whiskey. It was walking on 2 legs, big, covered in hair. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire. "A bear?" Ray suggested, but his tone showed he knew that wasn't what I meant. "Bears don't walk upright for more than a few steps," I said. This thing was walking like a man, but bigger than any man I've ever seen. Uncle Walt was studying me across the fire, his weathered face unreadable. "How big?" 6.5 feet at least. Shoulders wider than a doorframe, covered in dark hair, grayish-black. Jim snorted. "Sounds like you saw old Harry from the gas station." The others laughed, breaking the tension, all except Walt. "Did it see you?" Walt asked quietly. I nodded. "I think it was watching me sleep. When I woke up, it was walking away." "You sure you weren't dreaming, Samuel?" Elmer asked, but there was less mockery in his voice now. "I was wide awake," I insisted. "It was 10 feet from me. Clear as day." Walt took the flask back and had a long pull. "My daddy used to talk about something in these mountains. Called it different names depending on who he was talking to. To most folks, he'd say it was a wild man. To family, he called it by what the Indians named it." "What's that?" I asked. Walt shook his head. "Doesn't matter what it's called. What matters is you saw something you can't explain, and I believe you." The others exchanged glances. "You're saying you believe Sam saw Bigfoot?" Jim laughed. Walt didn't laugh. "I'm saying these mountains are old, and we don't know everything that lives in them. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside our tent had me reaching for my rifle. The others wrote off my experience as a combination of fatigue, shadows, and maybe the jerky we'd eaten, but I knew what I'd seen. The next day, we hunted different areas. I insisted on pairing up with Elmer rather than going solo again. We didn't see anything unusual, and by the time we headed home that evening, the others had mostly forgotten about my story. But I never forgot, not for a single day. Years passed. I still hunted those mountains, but never alone after that. I never told many people about what I'd seen. Those I did tell usually responded with polite skepticism or outright laughter. Then in 1967, I was watching the evening news when they showed a segment about a piece of film taken by a man named Roger Patterson up in Northern California. The footage showed a large, hair-covered creature walking along a creek bed. I sat up straight in my chair, spilling my coffee. There on my television screen was the same smooth, powerful gait, the same impossible silence despite its size, the same dark, hair-covered form. It was what I had seen 4 years earlier in the Sierra National Forest. I called Uncle Walt that night. "You seeing this Patterson film they're showing on the news?" I asked without preamble. "Yep," was all he said. "That's it, Walt. That's what I saw." There was a long pause on the line. "I know, Samuel, I know." Walt died 2 winters later. At his funeral, his brother, my father's older brother, whom I rarely saw, pulled me aside. "Walt told me about what you saw that day," he said quietly. "He saw one too back in 38. Never told nobody except me and now you. I've been back to those mountains many times since then. Never saw anything like it again. But sometimes, when I'm sitting quiet in the woods, I get that feeling. That same prickling on the back of my neck. The sensation of being watched. And I wonder if it's out there still, moving through the forest with impossible silence, watching us come and go in what has always been its home. I don't know what it was I saw that day in 1963. I can't prove anything, but I know what I saw. And when I close my eyes at night, sometimes I still see that massive, hair-covered figure silently disappearing into the trees, a mystery that walks on 2 legs through the ancient forests of America.